Hey friends, tonight we're drifting back in time to explore the 50 most significant events of the Middle Ages, spanning the years 500 to 1500. It was a world both familiar and strange, where faith could unite continents or spark war, where knowledge was guarded like treasure, and where the everyday could be as harsh as it was beautiful. This journey will carry you through pivotal political and military events, groundbreaking inventions, influential writings, and major religious milestones across Africa, Asia, and Europe, gently guiding your thoughts so you can relax, dream, and learn even as you sleep. If these strange stories help you drift off, hitting like and subscribe helps us in our never-ending duel with the YouTube algorithm and in our videos finding you again. So dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade, and let's slip quietly back to the year 523, when a man named Boethius, imprisoned and awaiting his fate, began to write The Consolation of Philosophy. 523 to 524, Boethius writes The Consolation of Philosophy, a fusion of classical thought and Christian theology penned in prison. It is the year 523, and Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, a Roman senator, scholar, and one of the last great philosophers of the ancient world, finds himself in a cold prison cell in Pavia. Once a trusted advisor to Theodoric the Great, ruler of the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy, Boethius had risen high in both political influence and intellectual reputation. Yet politics in the early Middle Ages was a treacherous arena. Accused of treason and conspiring with the Byzantine emperor, Boethius was arrested, stripped of his offices, and left to await execution. It was in this grim confinement that he would write one of the most remarkable works of the medieval period, The Consolation of Philosophy. The work unfolds as an imagined dialogue between Boethius himself and the personified figure of Lady Philosophy, who appears to him in his moment of despair. She is no gentle muse. Her entrance is regal and commanding, and she wastes no time chiding Boethius for wallowing in self-pity. Through their conversation, she guides him away from lamenting his misfortune toward contemplating the eternal truths that lie beyond the reach of fate. The text is divided into 5 books, moving from an acknowledgement of the instability of worldly fortune to the higher pursuit of virtue and the contemplation of the divine. One of the most striking features of the Consolation of Philosophy is its seamless fusion of classical Greek and Roman philosophical traditions, particularly the Stoicism of Seneca and the Platonism of Augustine, with the Christian moral outlook of late antiquity. However, it never explicitly invokes Christian scripture or doctrine, which has long intrigued scholars. Instead, Boethius frames his search for meaning in universal terms, making the work resonate across faiths and eras. His arguments explore the nature of happiness, the apparent randomness of fate, and the paradox of free will in a world governed by divine foreknowledge. The style alternates between prose and verse, a structure known as prosimetrum, which gives the work a rhythm that is both meditative and poetic. The verse passages offer lyrical reflections, while the prose sections drive the philosophical reasoning forward. This mixture likely made the text easier to memorize and recite, aiding its transmission through the manuscript culture of the Middle Ages. Boethius would never leave his prison alive. By 524, he was executed, reportedly through a brutal method involving a cord twisted around his head until his skull cracked. Yet his final work became a cornerstone of medieval intellectual life. Translated into multiple languages, including an influential English version by King Alfred the Great centuries later, it shaped the thought of thinkers from Thomas Aquinas to Chaucer. It stood as a reminder that even in the darkest political turmoil, the human mind could rise above circumstance to seek truth. 525. Invention of the Anno Domini calendar. Dionysius Exiguus's dating system reshapes how Europe reckons time. It is the year 525. Well, not that they called it that yet. In the monasteries of Scythia Minor, a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, or Denis the Little, as his Latin name humbly translates, leans over his writing desk. The candles sputter in the draught, but his quill glides across parchment with quiet conviction. The problem he's been asked to solve seems simple enough. Fix the tangled mess of dates used to calculate the Church's most important feast, Easter. For years, Christians across the known world have argued over the correct day. The tables are misaligned, the moon cycle's awkward, and the years counted from the reign of the old pagan emperor Diocletian. A man remembered more for persecuting Christians than for keeping a tidy calendar. Dionysius decides that this will not stand. Why should the faithful count their days from the memory of a tyrant? He proposes a bold alternative. Let all years be measured from the birth of Christ himself. No one is entirely sure which year that was. Dionysius has to make his best scholarly guess, but it feels right, righteous even. He calls his new system Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. With careful ink strokes, he replaces the shadow of Diocletian with the light of the Nativity. It is a quiet act, done in the stillness of a monastic cell, but one that will ripple across centuries. Monks in far-off lands will copy his tables, kings will stamp his reckoning into their charters, and historians will one day use his work to frame the entire story of human time. Dionysius does not live to see the world adopt his dating system, but in his heart, he believes he has pointed the calendar toward hope rather than fear. And so, without fanfare, the counting of years is reborn, rooted not in conquest, but in the memory of a child in Bethlehem. 529. Closure of the Platonic Academy. Justinian ends the last pagan philosophical school in Athens. It was the year 529, and in the sunlit hills just outside Athens, the hum of intellectual debate, once the heartbeat of the ancient world, was growing faint. The Platonic Academy, founded nearly 9 centuries earlier by Plato himself, had weathered wars, political upheavals, and philosophical revolutions. Generations of thinkers had walked its shaded paths, argued beneath its olive trees, and carved the future of Western thought from the raw marble of ideas. But now, those gates were closing. The order came from Emperor Justinian I, ruler of the Byzantine Empire and a devout Christian. To him, The academy was more than an ancient school. It was a vestige of paganism, a stubborn remnant of the old gods and their philosophies. In Justinian's vision of a unified Christian empire, such places were relics better buried than preserved. He decreed that all teaching of pagan philosophy be banned, effectively forcing the academy to shutter its doors. For the philosophers still there, men like Damasius, Simplicius, and Isidore, the blow was personal and civilizational. They were the last in a line that stretched back to Plato and Aristotle, heirs to a tradition that prized reason, dialectic, and the pursuit of truth for its own sake. They had debated the nature of the soul, the structure of the cosmos, and the meaning of virtue. And now, with the single imperial edict, their sanctuary was gone. In the days following the closure, the once lively lecture halls fell silent. The sound of quills scratching over parchment faded. The murmur of students discussing metaphysics over figs and wine gave way to the rustle of wind in abandoned courtyards. The academy's last scholars gathered what scrolls they could carry, wrapping them in cloth, unsure if these works would survive the journey ahead. Many of them fled east, seeking refuge in the Sasanian Empire under King Khosrow I, who welcomed them at the court of Ctesiphon. For a brief time, the torch of Greek philosophy burned there, mingling with Persian and Indian ideas in a cosmopolitan exchange. Some historians believe this exile helped preserve elements of Greek thought that would later return to Europe through Islamic scholars in the Middle Ages. Long after the Academy's marble columns had crumbled into dust, the closure of the Platonic Academy marked more than the end of a school. It was a symbolic turning point. It represented the twilight of classical antiquity and the dawn of a medieval world, shaped more by scripture than by Socratic questioning. Yet, like seeds scattered by the wind, the ideas nurtured within its walls would sprout in distant lands and future centuries, reminding us that even in exile, wisdom finds ways to endure. 529. Founding of Monte Cassino by Saint Benedict, birthplace of the Benedictine order and its monastic rule. In the year 529, high on a rocky hilltop between Rome and Naples, Saint Benedict of Nursia established what would become one of the most influential religious institutions in Western history, the monastery of Monte Cassino. The site itself had a long and layered past. It had once been a Roman fortress, and before that, a sacred ground for pagan worship dedicated to Apollo. When Benedict arrived with his small band of followers, he found ruins overgrown with weeds and lingering traces of pagan ritual. According to tradition, he destroyed the old altar, toppled the statue of Apollo, and consecrated the site to the Christian god, laying the foundations for a new kind of spiritual fortress. Benedict was already known for his strict but balanced approach to monastic life, shaped by his earlier experiences in Subiaco. At Monte Cassino, he would refine and write down his famous Rule of Saint Benedict, a framework for communal monastic living that emphasized prayer, work, study, and moderation. The motto, ora et labora, pray and work, captured his vision Unlike extreme ascetics who sought holiness through severe self-denial, Benedict advocated a steady rhythm of life where discipline was paired with compassion and spiritual devotion was harmonized with manual labor. This made the monastic life accessible to a broader range of people and sustainable over generations. Monte Cassino quickly became more than a place for quiet devotion. It was a hub of learning, preservation, and cultural transmission during a time when much of Western Europe was in political and economic turmoil. Monks copied manuscripts, tended gardens, developed agricultural techniques, and offered hospitality to travelers. They cared for the sick, educated novices, and became trusted advisors to local communities. In an age often defined by the collapse of central authority, Benedict's monastery functioned as a self-sufficient, stable micro-society, a model that would be replicated across Europe. The significance of Monte Cassino extended far beyond its walls. The Benedictine rule spread rapidly, influencing monastic communities for centuries and shaping the moral and intellectual landscape of medieval Christendom. Its emphasis on humility, obedience, and mutual service resonated with kings and peasants alike. Even centuries later, during periods of reform or crisis, the rule remained a touchstone for what monastic life could and should be. Monte Cassino itself would face destruction and rebuilding many times. From Lombard invasions in the 6th century to the Allied bombing in World War II. But Benedict's vision endured. The hilltop monastery he founded in 529 became both a spiritual beacon and a living reminder that even amid the ruins of an old world, new communities could rise, anchored in faith, discipline, and the pursuit of the good life. 570, birth of Muhammad, future founder of Islam, whose teachings will reshape the medieval world. It's the year 570. In the bustling trading city of Mecca, under the sweltering Arabian sun, a child is born who will one day change the course of history. His name is Muhammad ibn Abdullah, born into the respected Quraysh tribe, though his early life would be marked as much by loss as by promise. His father dies before he is born, and by the age of 6, his mother too has passed, leaving him an orphan cared for first by his grandfather and then by his uncle, Abu Talib. Mecca at this time is a hub of caravans and cultures, a city defined by its position on trade routes that link the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. Merchants haggle in the markets over spices, textiles, and incense. Pilgrims from far-off tribes visit the Kaaba, a sacred shrine said to have been built by Abraham and his son Ishmael, housing idols of many gods. It is a city of wealth and poverty, generosity and greed, tribal honor, and simmering rivalries. Young Muhammad grows up learning the ways of the caravan trade, traveling across deserts and through foreign markets. He earns a reputation for honesty and reliability, acquiring the nickname Al-Amin, the trustworthy. But his world is not without contradictions. He sees the sharp divide between the rich merchant elite and the poor, the prevalence of idol worship, and the neglect of widows and orphans. These experiences begin to plant seeds of reflection in his mind, questions about morality, justice, and the nature of the divine. Though no one in Mecca could have imagined it at the time, this boy, quiet yet observant, compassionate yet determined, would grow to be the Prophet Muhammad, founder of Islam, whose teachings would unite much of the Arabian Peninsula and influence civilizations for centuries to come. His birth in 570 would later be remembered in Islamic tradition as the Year of the Elephant, a reference to a legendary event in which an invading army, led by an Ethiopian general and accompanied by war elephants, was miraculously turned back from attacking Mecca. For now, however, Muhammad's story is still only beginning. Just one life among thousands in a city that believes it knows its future. History, of course, has other plans. 622. Hijrah of Muhammad to Medina. The Islamic calendar begins, marking Islam's formative migration. It's the year 622, and the heat over the Arabian desert feels like the world itself is holding its breath. In the bustling city of Mecca, tension has been building for years. Muhammad, a man once known simply as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, has been preaching a message that challenges the old order. There is only one God, and the idols that line the Kaaba are nothing but stone and wood. For the powerful merchant clans of Mecca, this is more than a theological dispute. It's an economic and political threat. Pilgrims from across Arabia come to worship at the Kaaba's idols, and that trade keeps Mecca rich. Now, the man they once respected is seen as a dangerous disruptor. His followers, the early Muslims, face mockery, beatings, and boycotts. Some have already fled north to Christian Abyssinia for safety. But as the hostility grows sharper, an invitation arrives from a place far to the north, the oasis town of Yathrib. Two rival tribes there, tired of generations of blood feuds, believe Muhammad's wisdom and reputation for fairness could bring peace. They ask him to come, not as a preacher alone, but as a mediator and leader. The journey that follows, the Hijrah, is no casual caravan trip. It's a calculated escape, carried out under the watchful eyes of enemies who would rather see Muhammad dead than gone. Tradition tells of him hiding in a cave with his companion Abu Bakr, as pursuers pass dangerously close. A spider spinning a web across the entrance, making it appear undisturbed. When Muhammad finally arrives in Yathrib, the welcome is unlike anything in Mecca. Families open their homes, crowds gather to greet him, and the city itself gains a new name. Medina, the city of the Prophet. But this is more than a relocation. It's the turning of a page in world history. In Medina, Muhammad is not just a spiritual guide, but a statesman, forging agreements between Muslim and Jewish tribes, laying down laws, and defending the community against Meccan attacks. The Islamic calendar will mark this year, 622, as year one. The Hijrah becomes both a symbol and a starting point. The moment a persecuted movement transforms into a united, self-governing community. And from this desert city, The message that began in Mecca will grow into one of the world's great civilizations. 632. Death of Muhammad. Rapid expansion of Islamic rule begins. It is the year 632, and the hot winds of the Arabian Peninsula carry with them both grief and uncertainty. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, has died in the city of Medina after a brief illness. For his followers, many of whom had only recently embraced the new faith, this is a moment of profound loss. Just 2 years earlier, most of Arabia had united under Islam, and now the man whose vision, leadership, and words had brought that unity was gone. The question that immediately arose was not just who would lead, but whether the fragile bonds of this new community could hold without him. In the tense days following his death, Muhammad's close companions convened to choose a leader. Their decision fell on Abu Bakr, a trusted friend of the Prophet and one of the earliest converts to Islam. Taking the title of Caliph, successor, Abu Bakr's first task was to keep the Ummah, the Muslim community, from splintering. Several tribes tried to break away, seeing the Prophet's death as a chance to return to old alliances. Abu Bakr responded decisively, launching the Ridda Wars to bring them back under Islamic authority. His firmness ensured that Islam did not remain a purely local religion, tied to one man's lifetime, but instead became a growing political and spiritual force. With Arabia stabilized, attention turned outward. The armies of the Caliphate, motivated by faith and the promise of unity, began campaigns beyond the peninsula. At first, these were raids into Byzantine and Sasanian territory, but soon they became full-scale conquests. Within a decade, Muslim forces had seized Damascus, Jerusalem, and vast swaths of the Persian Empire. These early expansions were not simply military. They also spread new systems of governance, legal codes based on Islamic principles, and a sense of belonging to something greater than any one tribe or city. The death of Muhammad could have ended the movement he began, as so often happens when a charismatic founder passes. Instead, it marked the beginning of Islam's transformation from a small community into a world power. Under the early caliphs, the faith's message and political reach spread at a pace almost unmatched in history. Its influence radiating from Medina across deserts, mountains, and seas, reshaping the map of the known world. 632 to 661. Rashidun Caliphate. First caliphs consolidate religious and political power. In the years following the death of Muhammad in 632, leadership of the Muslim community passed to the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Their task was monumental, not only to preserve Muhammad's religious legacy, but to unify a fast-growing empire under both faith and law. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, swiftly put down internal revolts during the Ridda Wars, reaffirming that Islam was not a tribal pact, but a permanent religious community. His successor, Umar ibn al-Khattab, oversaw an era of astonishing military expansion. Muslim forces swept through the Levant, Persia, and Egypt, defeating both Byzantine and Sasanian empires in rapid succession. The conquered lands were integrated through a mix of military governance, tax systems, and religious tolerance for people of the book, laying the groundwork for a multi-ethnic empire. Uthman ibn Affan, the third caliph, standardized the Quran into a single written text, ensuring uniformity in Islamic teaching. However, accusations of nepotism and political favoritism during his rule deepened divisions within the Ummah. In 656, Uthman was assassinated, plunging the caliphate into its first civil war, the First Fitna. Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, faced fierce opposition from rival factions, most notably from Muawiyah, governor of Syria. Battles at the Camel and Siffin marked a violent struggle for legitimacy. The disputes were not only political, but carried theological weight, influencing the eventual Sunni-Shia split. By 661, Ali was assassinated and the Rashidun Caliphate came to a close, giving way to the Umayyad dynasty. In less than 30 years, the caliphs had transformed Islam from a regional movement into a sprawling empire, binding together faith and governance, but also planting the seeds of enduring sectarian divisions. 664, Synod of Whitby. England aligns Christian practice with Roman customs. In 664 CE, the Synod of Whitby marked a turning point in the religious identity of early medieval England. For decades, the Christian communities in the British Isles had been divided between two traditions: the Celtic Church, rooted in Irish monasticism and local customs, and the Roman Church, aligned with the papacy and continental Europe. Their differences were not theological so much as practical: when to celebrate Easter, how monks should cut their hair, and the form of certain rituals. Still, these details mattered greatly as they symbolized which authority a kingdom recognized. King Oswiu of Northumbria, whose court included both Celtic and Roman clergy, found the division increasingly awkward. His own queen, Eanfled, followed the Roman Easter, meaning that while she celebrated the resurrection, the king might still be fasting for Lent. The mismatch was more than a domestic inconvenience. It was a matter of unity in the kingdom and in the church. At the monastery of Whitby, presided over by the formidable Abbess Hilda, Oswiu gathered leading clerics from both traditions to debate the issue. The Celtic side, led by Bishop Colman, emphasized the heritage of Saint Columba and the holiness of Irish missionary work. The Roman party, represented by Wilfrid, argued for the authority of Saint Peter, holder of the keys to heaven, insisting that uniformity with Rome connected England to the wider Christian world. In the end, Oswiu sided with Rome, declaring that he dared not oppose the gatekeeper of heaven himself. The decision standardized religious practice across his realm, aligning Northumbria and eventually much of England with continental Christianity. While the Celtic tradition persisted in some areas, the Synod of Whitby symbolized the gradual integration of the English Church into the broader Latin Christian network, shaping the cultural and political landscape for centuries. 732, Battle of Tours. Charles Martel halts Muslim expansion into Frankish territory. In the year 732, On the rolling plains near the city of Tours, in what is now western France, one of the most pivotal clashes of the early Middle Ages unfolded. The Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers. At the heart of it stood Charles Martel, the Frankish military leader, whose nickname, the Hammer, would become synonymous with both his ferocity in battle and his unyielding determination. For years leading up to this moment, Muslim forces from the Umayyad Caliphate had steadily pushed north from the Iberian Peninsula, conquering vast territories and establishing a strong presence in what is now Spain and Portugal. Their advances into Gaul were swift and strategic, threatening the patchwork of kingdoms and duchies that made up the Frankish realm. The Umayyad forces, led by the governor of Al-Andalus, Abdul-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, had recently plundered the rich city of Bordeaux and were moving deeper into Frankish lands, loaded with spoils. Charles Martel understood that this was more than a raid. It was a potential turning point in European history. Gathering a coalition of Frankish warriors and allied forces, he chose the ground carefully, positioning his troops on high terrain, using the dense forest around him to hide the true size of his army. Unlike the swift cavalry charges favored by the Umayyads, the Franks relied heavily on disciplined infantry formations. Charles drilled his men to stand firm, locking their shields together in a defensive wall that could absorb the impact of cavalry. When the battle began, wave after wave of Umayyad horsemen crashed against the Frankish lines, but the wall held. For an entire day, the fighting was fierce, with neither side able to break the other. As evening approached, fortune shifted when Abdul-Rahman was killed in the melee. Leaderless and wary of being surrounded, the Umayyad forces began to withdraw under the cover of night. By morning, they had retreated entirely, leaving behind their dead and much of their loot. The Battle of Tours was not the end of Muslim influence in Europe. Al-Andalus remained a center of culture and power in Spain for centuries, but it marked the northern limit of their expansion. Charles Martel's victory was celebrated as the defense of Christendom, though historians today debate whether the battle was as decisive as later chroniclers claimed. Still, the victory cemented Charles Martel's legacy, paving the way for the Carolingian dynasty and ultimately the reign of his grandson, Charlemagne. In the lore of medieval Europe, Tours became a symbol of resilience, the moment when a determined commander and his steadfast soldiers turned the tide against a seemingly unstoppable force. 751, Battle of Talas, Tang China versus Abbasids. Paper-making knowledge spreads westward. It's the year 751, and on the banks of the Talas River in Central Asia, two great civilizations are about to collide, not just with swords and spears, but with the weight of their entire worlds behind them. On one side stands the Tang dynasty of China, whose influence stretches deep into the Silk Road, commanding respect through advanced administration, a flourishing economy, and a military known for discipline and adaptability. On the other side, the Abbasid Caliphate, a rising power in the Islamic world, whose rapid expansion across the Middle East and Central Asia has been fueled by both religious fervor and strategic alliances. The battle itself was born of more than simple territorial ambition. The region around Talus was a crossroads of cultures, a place where Turkic tribes, Persian merchants, and Chinese envoys mingled. Both empires sought influence over these lucrative trade routes, and both saw the other as an obstacle to that goal. The Abbasids were also aided by their Karluk Turk allies, tribes who had initially fought alongside the Tang, but switched sides mid-battle in one of history's most decisive betrayals. When the fighting began, the Tang forces under General Gao Xianji were disciplined and well-equipped, using tight formations and a mix of infantry, cavalry, and advanced siege techniques adapted for open battle. The Abbasids, led by Ziyad ibn Salih, relied heavily on mobile cavalry, swift charges, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. For several days, the struggle swayed back and forth, neither side delivering a final blow. But the Karluk defection tipped the scales dramatically, turning a balanced fight into a rout for the Tang army. The Tang forces suffered a crushing defeat, withdrawing eastward and never again exerting serious influence west of the Pamir Mountains. This marked the limit of Chinese expansion into Central Asia and opened the door for Islamic influence to spread further east. Politically and militarily, it was a major turning point, but its cultural consequences were perhaps even greater. According to historical accounts, one of the unexpected outcomes of the Abbasid victory was the transfer of Chinese paper-making technology westward. Chinese prisoners of war, skilled in the craft, were brought to Samarkand, where they shared their knowledge. This innovation transformed the Islamic world's ability to record and disseminate information, replacing expensive parchment with affordable, durable paper. Over time, the technique spread across the Middle East, into North Africa, and eventually to Europe, playing a key role in the preservation and expansion of knowledge during the Middle Ages and beyond. Thus, the Battle of Talas was more than a clash of armies. It was a moment where the fate of continents shifted, where a military defeat planted the seeds of a communication revolution that would help shape the intellectual future of the world. 754. Donation of Pepin. Establishment of the Papal States. In the year 754, one of the most consequential political religious deals of the Middle Ages unfolded, an agreement that would shape European politics for centuries, the donation of Pepin. This event, occurring during the reign of Pepin III, better known as Pepin the Short, marks the formal establishment of the Papal States in central Italy. It was more than just a land grant. It was a diplomatic masterstroke that fused spiritual authority with temporal power, setting the stage for a millennium of church-state entanglement. The background begins with the decline of the Byzantine Empire's influence in Italy. For centuries, the popes had nominally been under Byzantine protection, but by the 8th century, Constantinople was too distracted by its own crises to defend the papacy from Lombard aggression. The Lombards, a Germanic people who had carved out their own kingdom in Italy, were pressing hard against Rome. Pope Stephen II found himself in a dire position, militarily weak, politically isolated, and under imminent threat of conquest. Enter Pepin the Short, the first Carolingian king of the Franks. Pepin owed the papacy a political debt. Just a few years earlier, Pope Zachary had approved the deposition of the last Merovingian king, allowing Pepin to take the throne in 751. That papal endorsement had been critical to legitimizing Pepin's rule. Now, in 753, Pope Stephen crossed the Alps, an extraordinary act for a pontiff, to personally seek Frankish aid. This was the first recorded time a pope had visited the lands beyond the Alps, underscoring the urgency of the crisis. In 754, after negotiations and mutual pledges, Pepin agreed not only to defend the papacy, but to grant the pope control over key territories in central Italy, including lands previously held by the Byzantines. This grant, formalized in what became known as the Donation of Pepin, created the Papal States, a theocratic domain stretching across the Italian peninsula's center. For the first time, the Pope was not just the spiritual leader of Western Christendom, but also a sovereign ruler in his own right. The deal was sealed with an exchange of symbols and ritual. At Saint-Denis, Pepin was anointed by the Pope himself, reinforcing the divine legitimacy of his kingship. In return, Pepin's donation guaranteed the Pope independence from both Lombard and Byzantine control. Militarily, the Franks marched into Italy and forced the Lombards to surrender the contested lands to the papacy. Politically, the alliance solidified the emerging bond between the Frankish kingdom and the Roman Church, a bond that would later culminate in the crowning of Pepin's son, Charlemagne, as emperor in 800. The donation of Pepin thus did more than redraw the map. It forged a precedent. Western rulers could gain legitimacy through papal blessing, and the papacy could wield secular power with the backing of kings. This intertwining of church and state would shape European diplomacy, conflicts, and political theory throughout the Middle Ages, leaving a legacy that would last until the 19th century. 800, Charlemagne crowned Holy Roman Emperor, symbolic revival of Western Roman authority. It's the year 800, and Rome is about to witness a scene heavy with both ceremony and political calculation. On Christmas Day, in the great Basilica of St. Peter's, the air smells faintly of incense and cold stone. Candles flicker against mosaics that tell the story of an empire long gone, or at least long transformed. At the center of the nave stands Charles, King of the Franks, a man whose height, commanding presence, and record of military conquests have already earned him near mythical status among his people. But today, his role is not that of a warrior. Today, he kneels. Pope Leo III approaches, carrying an ornate crown, gold gleaming against the candlelight. As the choir's chant swells, Leo places the crown upon Charles's head. Charles, most serene Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific Emperor of the Romans, he proclaims. The gathered clergy and nobles cheer, and the Roman people echo their acclamation. In that moment, something unprecedented happens. The Holy Roman Empire is born, or reborn, depending on how you see it. The act is more than a coronation. It is a symbolic bridge between the ancient glory of the Roman Empire and the new Christian order of medieval Europe. This was not simply a feel-good ceremony. For centuries after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476, No one in the West had claimed the imperial title. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople still considered itself the true Rome, but the papacy had grown increasingly distant from Byzantine influence, especially after political tensions and theological disputes. By crowning Charlemagne, Pope Leo III effectively declared the papacy's independence from the East, while also securing a powerful protector in the West. For Charlemagne, the new title reinforced his authority over a realm that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. It wasn't just about prestige. It was a formal recognition that his rule carried universal Christian legitimacy. It also gave a sacred dimension to his authority, aligning him with the legacy of Roman emperors, who were seen as divinely appointed. Still, there's debate among historians about whether Charlemagne knew beforehand about the Pope's intention to crown him. Some sources claim he would not have entered the basilica if he had known, perhaps wary of appearing subordinate to the Pope. In any case, the Christmas coronation of 800 was a turning point. It forged the concept of a unified Christian empire in the West, one in which political power and spiritual authority were deeply entwined. The title of Holy Roman Emperor would endure, sometimes in name more than in reality, for 1,000 years. And in the candlelit glow of St. Peter's that winter morning, a medieval vision of Rome's rebirth took shape, one that would shape European politics for centuries. 843, Treaty of Verdun, division of Charlemagne's empire into 3 realms. It's the year 843, and the mighty empire forged by Charlemagne, spanning much of Western and Central Europe, has begun to show cracks. When he died in 814, the imperial crown passed to his only surviving son, Louis the Pious, whose long reign was marked by a mix of piety, reform, and bitter family squabbles. Louis tried to maintain unity, but his efforts were undermined by a classic medieval problem: succession disputes among ambitious heirs. His sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, spent years in uneasy alliances and open warfare, each determined to secure the best slice of their father's legacy. By the time Louis the Pious died in 840, the conflict had spiraled into a full-scale civil war. For 3 years, the brothers clashed in battles that saw shifting loyalties, opportunistic nobles, and a Europe weary of constant fighting. The conflict came to a head at the Battle of Fontenoy in 841, where thousands were slaughtered, and the dream of a unified Carolingian empire lay in ruins. Realizing continued war would only weaken their realms and leave them vulnerable to external threats, particularly Viking raids in the north and Muslim incursions in the south, the brothers reluctantly agreed to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Verdun, signed in August 843. The treaty carved the empire into 3 distinct kingdoms. Lothair I, the eldest, kept the imperial title and a long central strip of territory stretching from the North Sea through the Low Countries, Burgundy, and into northern Italy. A region later, historians would dub Middle Francia. Louis the German took lands east of the Rhine, forming the nucleus of what would become the German-speaking world. Charles the Bald received the Western territories, much of modern-day France. While this arrangement brought a temporary peace, it also formalized the political fragmentation of Western Europe. The Treaty of Verdun is often seen as a pivotal moment in European history, not only because it ended the immediate bloodshed, but because it set the geographic and cultural foundations for the modern nations of France and Germany. The division also weakened the Carolingian dynasty's overall authority, accelerating the rise of regional lords and feudalism. In essence, Verdun marked the end of the dream of a single, unified Christian empire in the West and ushered in a new political reality, a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each with its own ambitions, rivalries, and vulnerabilities. It was a compromise born of exhaustion, but its consequences would shape the continent for centuries. 864, Edict of Pistres. Charles the Bald strengthens defenses against Viking raids. It's the year 864, and if you happen to be living in the lands ruled by Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, you've probably had enough of Viking longships for one lifetime. For decades, Norse raiders had been pushing their way down rivers like the Seine and Loire, sacking towns, plundering monasteries, and generally making a mockery of Frankish defenses. The problem was painfully clear. The Vikings could show up almost anywhere with terrifying speed, strike hard, and be gone before a proper army could even get its boots on. Something had to change. Charles the Bald, no stranger to political trouble at home, realized that scattered reactive defenses simply weren't working. So in 864, he issued the Edict of Pistres, named after the royal assembly held at Pistres, modern-day Petrus, in Normandy. This wasn't just a quick pep talk to his nobles. It was a serious, multi-pronged strategy to finally bring the fight to the invaders on better terms. First, Charles ordered the construction of fortified bridges across key rivers. These weren't just for travel. They were designed with strong towers and defensive works to physically block Viking ships from sailing upriver. In effect, these bridges acted like medieval toll gates, except instead of paying a fee, the Vikings might get a volley of arrows and a lot of unpleasant shouting. By controlling these choke points, Charles aimed to deny the Norsemen access to the heartland altogether. Second, the edict required the creation of a more mobile, better trained cavalry force. Up to this point, the Franks had relied heavily on slower moving infantry, which simply couldn't keep pace with hit-and-run raids. By increasing the number of mounted troops, Charles hoped to respond faster and pursue Viking bands before they could melt back to their ships. This was a shift in military thinking, a recognition that speed and mobility could counter the lightning-fast raids that had been the Vikings' biggest advantage. The edict also pushed for a greater sense of shared responsibility among the Frankish nobility. Defending the realm from raiders was no longer just the king's problem. It was an obligation that fell on local lords who were expected to maintain their own fortified points and contribute troops to the common defense. In other words, Charles was trying to create a more coordinated, kingdom-wide security system instead of relying on piecemeal, ad hoc responses. While the Vikings didn't vanish overnight, they continued to raid for decades. The Edict of Pistres marked a turning point. The fortified bridges in particular proved a clever, durable solution, and some would remain standing for centuries. Charles's reforms helped lay the groundwork for a more resilient, fortified France, and hinted at a broader trend in medieval Europe. The shift from reactive defense to proactive, infrastructure-based protection. It was, in many ways, the first step toward turning the tide against the longship menace. 9/11, Treaty of St. Clair, sur Epte, Rollo, and the foundation of Normandy. It's the year 9/11, and the chill wind off the river Epte carries the weight of history in its breath. For decades now, Viking longships have prowled the rivers of Francia, their carved prows slicing through morning mist like silent predators. Monasteries have burned, towns have been sacked, and even Paris itself has felt the hot breath of Norse ambition. But this year marks a strange turn in that long and bloody story, one not written in fire and iron, but in ink and uneasy handshake. The man on the Frankish side is Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, grandson of Charles the Bald. His kingdom, battered by decades of raids, is a patchwork of loyal nobles and wary towns. He knows that walls and watchtowers alone won't keep the longships away forever. The man on the other side is Rollo, a Viking leader whose reputation is as wide as the Seine. Rollo is not a petty raider. He's a warlord who understands the value of land as well as plunder. He has spent years fighting up and down the coast, seizing territory when he can, and Paris has already seen his shadow more than once. When the two meet at St. Clair sur Epte, the atmosphere is tense. The treaty they forge is both pragmatic and radical. Rollo will be granted land in the lower Seine Valley, a fertile and strategic prize. In return, he will swear loyalty to Charles the Simple, defend the river approaches from other Vikings, and, at least in theory, convert to Christianity. It's a bargain born of exhaustion as much as calculation. For Charles, it is a way to turn a predator into a guard dog. For Rollo, it is the chance to trade a life of perpetual raiding for one of lordship and permanence. According to later chronicles, the negotiations have a theatrical touch. One story claims Charles demanded that Rollo kneel and kiss his foot in submission. The proud Viking refused, and instead ordered one of his men to perform the gesture for him, lifting the king's foot so abruptly that Charles toppled backward. Whether the tale is true or embroidered by storytellers, it captures the essence of the moment. Neither side entirely trusted the other, but both understood the value of this alliance. The land granted to Rollo would grow into Normandy, the land of the Northmen. From this seed would sprout one of medieval Europe's most dynamic duchies, producing warriors, traders, and eventually a man named William, who would cross the English Channel and change the fate of England forever. But here, in 9/11, all of that is still distant. On the banks of the Epte, a Viking warlord becomes a Christian duke, and a weary king buys peace with land, hoping that this time the bargain will hold. 962. Otto I crowned Holy Roman Emperor. The Ottonian dynasty begins. It's the year 962, And in the candlelit grandeur of Old St. Peter's Basilica, history is being hammered into shape, one golden crown at a time. Otto I, already King of the Germans and Duke of Saxony, kneels before Pope John XII. Outside, Rome is dusty and restless, with merchants hawking figs and relics in the shadows of crumbling imperial ruins. Inside, incense swirls like a slow-moving storm, the air heavy with the scent of frankincense and politics. The coronation is more than ceremony, it's a power deal. Otto has already proven himself a formidable ruler, uniting fractious duchies under his leadership and smashing the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, ending their raids into Central Europe. That victory didn't just save his people from destruction, it earned him immense prestige. Now, the Pope, facing his own enemies in Rome and beyond, needs a strong arm to protect the papacy. Otto is happy to provide it for the right price. The revival of the title, Emperor of the Romans in the West, vacant since the Carolingians lost their grip. When the crown is placed on his head, Otto becomes the first Holy Roman Emperor of what historians will call the Ottonian dynasty. This isn't simply a nostalgic nod to Charlemagne, it's the birth of a political order that will dominate Central Europe for centuries. Otto's realm stretches from the North Sea to the Alps, from the Rhine to the Elbe, and he rules with a mix of calculated generosity and unflinching authority. He appoints loyal bishops and abbots to key positions, ensuring the church is both spiritually useful and politically obedient. In practice, the Holy Roman Empire is less a unified nation and more a patchwork quilt of territories bound together by personal loyalty and imperial prestige. But Otto's diplomatic skill, marrying his son into Byzantine royalty, forging alliances with Lombards and Slavs, gives it real weight on the international stage. As the choir's chant fades and Otto rises with the imperial regalia, he is not just crowned a ruler of men, but anointed as God's chosen defender of Christendom in the West. It is a title that carries both glory and burden, and under the Ottonian dynasty, the empire will expand, consolidate, and set the template for medieval German kingship. One where the emperor must always balance the will of the sword, the altar, and the restless ambitions of dukes. 1054, the Great Schism, formal split between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. It is the year 1054, and the Christian world is about to experience a fracture that will echo for centuries. For centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Christian Church had maintained an uneasy unity despite vast differences in language, culture, and political power between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. But under the surface, tension simmered. Theological disputes, liturgical differences, and the growing rivalry between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople made unity fragile. Theological disagreements were not new. Western Christians emphasized the authority of the Pope as the successor of St. Peter, while the Eastern Church upheld a model of collective leadership among the patriarchs of the great cities, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, with the Patriarch of Constantinople considered first among equals. One famous theological flashpoint was the Filioque clause in the Nicene Creed. The original creed, written in Greek, stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. The Western Church added the Latin word filioque and the Son, declaring that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. To the Eastern Church, this was a unilateral and unauthorized change to a sacred text and a sign of Rome's arrogance. Cultural and political differences deepened the divide. The West leaned on Latin law, scholastic thinking, and increasingly centralized papal authority. The East embraced Greek philosophy, Byzantine court culture, and a symbiotic relationship between emperor and patriarch. Even practical matters like clerical marriage became points of contention. Western priests were expected to remain celibate, while in the East, parish priests could marry. The breaking point came in 1054 when Pope Leo IX sent Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida to Constantinople to negotiate disputes with Patriarch Michael Cerularius. The talks quickly soured. Humbert accused the Eastern Church of heresy over its refusal to accept papal supremacy, while Cerularius condemned Latin practices, such as using unleavened bread in the Eucharist. In July 1054, in a stunning public gesture, Humbert placed a papal bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia, declaring the Patriarch and his followers outside the church. Cerularius responded in kind, excommunicating Humbert and his delegation. Although many at the time saw it as a political quarrel that might eventually heal, this moment became the symbolic point of no return. The Great Schism. The Christian Church split into the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. The rift would persist for nearly 1,000 years, shaping the politics, culture, and faith of Europe and beyond, and leaving two great branches of Christianity to grow apart while still tracing their roots to the same beginnings. 1066, Norman conquest of England. William the Conqueror changes English culture and politics. It's the year 1066, a date every English schoolchild eventually memorizes, and the English throne is up for grabs. When Edward the Confessor, King of England, dies childless in January, the political chessboard explodes into a full-scale contest between rival claimants. Harold Godwinson, a powerful English noble and the king's brother-in-law, is crowned almost immediately. But across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, insists that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and that Harold had even sworn an oath to support his claim. To make matters more complicated, Harald Hardrada, the fearsome King of Norway, also asserts his right to rule England. The year becomes a dizzying sequence of military gambles. First, Hardrada lands in the north with a fleet, forcing Harold Godwinson to rush his army hundreds of miles to meet the threat. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September, Harold's forces win a bloody victory, killing Hardrada and ending the Viking era's last major invasion of England. But even as Harold is catching his breath, word arrives that William has landed in the south at Pevensey Bay. William's Norman forces are a blend of cavalry, infantry, and archers, a combined arms approach relatively unfamiliar to the English. Harold, exhausted from the northern campaign, marches his army south in record time to confront William near Hastings on October 14th. The battle that follows is one of the most famous in medieval history. English forces form a shield wall on a hilltop, repelling repeated Norman attacks. Several times, William's men feign retreat, luring segments of the English army into breaking formation and rushing downhill, where they are cut down by cavalry. After hours of brutal fighting, Harold is killed, tradition says by an arrow to the eye, and the English defense collapses. William advances toward London, facing sporadic resistance before the city surrenders. On Christmas Day, 1066, William is crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, securing his place in history as William the Conqueror. The Norman conquest transforms England's culture, language, and politics. Norman French becomes the language of the elite, blending with Old English over centuries to form Middle English. The feudal system is imposed, redistributing land to Norman nobles and altering the social hierarchy. Castles appear across the landscape as symbols of military dominance and administrative control. The Domesday Book, compiled 2 decades later, reflects a deeply changed England, one tied into a wider European network of politics and culture. In short, 1066 is more than a battle. It is the starting point of a new Anglo-Norman world. 1071, Battle of Manzikert, Byzantine defeat opens Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks. It's the summer of 1071, and the dust of the Anatolian steppe hangs thick in the air. On one side stands the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, his army a patchwork of professional soldiers, mercenaries, and feudal levies from across the empire's vast and diverse territories. On the other side waits Sultan Alp Arslan of the Seljuk Turks, whose forces are lean, mobile, and perfectly adapted to the wide open terrain. The meeting place, near the fortress town of Manzikert, in what is now eastern Turkey, a crossroads of empires and the setting for one of the most consequential battles of the Middle Ages. The Byzantine Empire in the mid-11th century was still powerful, but cracks had begun to show. Political intrigue in Constantinople often undermined military campaigns, and the empire's frontiers faced pressure from multiple sides. The Seljuk Turks, a rising force in the Islamic world, had been steadily encroaching on Byzantine territory in Asia Minor, testing defenses and exploiting weak garrisons. Romanos, eager to reassert imperial strength and secure his eastern borders, decided to launch a major campaign to push the Turks back. His plan was bold, perhaps too bold for the realities of his army's cohesion. When the two forces finally confronted each other on August 26, 1071, the Byzantines initially seemed to have the advantage in numbers and equipment. Romanos's heavily armed cavalry and disciplined infantry advanced against the more lightly equipped Seljuks, who responded with their signature hit-and-run tactics. Skilled mounted archers harassed the Byzantine lines, loosing volleys of arrows before retreating out of reach, luring the enemy forward. The heat, the dust, and the relentless harassment began to erode Byzantine discipline. The turning point came late in the day. Miscommunication between Romanos and his subordinate commanders, some of whom may have been disloyal, caused parts of the Byzantine army to withdraw at the wrong moment, exposing flanks and creating chaos. The Seljuks seized the opportunity, surrounding and overwhelming the emperor's forces. Romanos himself was wounded and captured by Alp Arslan, an event that shocked the Christian world. Alp Arslan, known for his chivalry, treated the emperor respectfully, even negotiating a relatively lenient ransom and peace agreement. Yet the political consequences for Byzantium were disastrous. Romanos's capture undermined his legitimacy, sparking a civil war that drained resources and further weakened imperial control. In the years that followed, the Seljuks poured into the heart of Anatolia, settling in lands that had been Byzantine for centuries. The Battle of Manzikert was not just a single military defeat. It was the moment that shifted the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. It opened the door for the gradual Turkification and Islamization of Anatolia, setting the stage for the rise of the Ottoman Empire centuries later. For the Byzantines, it marked the beginning of a long, slow decline from which they would never fully recover. 1095, Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade. It's the year 1095, and the chill of late November hangs over the town of Clermont in central France. Here, a gathering unlike any other in Christendom has been called by Pope Urban II, a man of measured speech and sharp political instincts. The Byzantine Empire, battered by decades of war and humiliated after the crushing defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, has sent word to the west. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, facing the Seljuk Turks' advance deep into Anatolia, requests military aid from his fellow Christians. Urban sees in this plea not only an opportunity to defend fellow believers, but also a chance to unite the often feuding princes and nobles of Europe under one banner, and perhaps extend papal influence eastward. By the time Urban ascends a wooden platform before the crowd, the atmosphere is electric. The audience is a mix of bishops, knights, local peasants, and wandering pilgrims, some curious, others drawn by whispers of a holy cause. Chroniclers would later disagree on the exact words spoken, but all accounts agree on the passion in Urban's voice. He paints a vivid, almost unbearable picture of Christian pilgrims suffering at the hands of the Turks, of holy sites desecrated, of Jerusalem, the sacred heart of Christendom, in peril. His call is clear. It is the duty of every able Christian to take up arms, not for conquest or wealth, but for God. Then comes the rhetorical spark that will ignite centuries of conflict. Those who go, Urban declares, shall be absolved of their sins, their spiritual debts wiped clean in exchange for their service. The concept of indulgence, already known in church practice, now fuses with the idea of holy war. To many in the crowd, this is more than a military summons. It is a pathway to eternal salvation. The response is immediate and overwhelming. From the crowd, voices shout, Deus vult, God wills it, a cry that will echo across Europe. Messengers will carry the Pope's words far and wide, and within months, armies of knights, foot soldiers, and even untrained peasants will begin their march toward the eastern Mediterranean. What began as a carefully orchestrated political and spiritual maneuver will spiral into the First Crusade, a campaign that will reshape not only the map of the Near East, but also the very fabric of medieval society. In Clermont that day, the idea of a united Christendom marching to reclaim the Holy Land was born, and with it, the centuries-long entanglement of faith, warfare, and ambition that would define much of the Middle Ages. 1099. Capture of Jerusalem by Crusaders. Establishment of Crusader states. In the summer of 1099, the armies of the First Crusade, exhausted, battle-worn, and reduced in number, arrived before the walls of Jerusalem. Their journey had begun years earlier in response to Pope Urban II's call to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, but by the time they reached their final destination, the Crusaders were a fraction of the force that had left Europe. Still, they were driven by religious fervor, a desire for redemption, and the promise of eternal salvation. Jerusalem at the time was under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate, which had taken it from the Seljuks just a year prior. The city's fortifications were formidable, thick walls, strong towers, and defenders determined to resist. The Crusaders, lacking siege equipment, initially found themselves at a disadvantage, but they improvised. Timber for siege towers was hauled from miles away, and under the blistering summer heat of July, they prepared for the final assault. On July 15th, after days of intense fighting, the Crusaders breached the walls. The forces under Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond IV of Toulouse, and other leaders stormed the city. What followed was one of the most infamous episodes of the Crusades, a massacre of much of Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish population. Chroniclers, especially those in Europe, described the streets running red with blood, a detail often repeated in both medieval accounts and modern retellings. Whether exaggerated or not, it reflected the Crusaders' grim determination to secure the city entirely. Once Jerusalem was in their hands, the Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the most prominent of several Crusader states that would serve as Christian strongholds in the Levant. Other states soon followed: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These were not merely military outposts. They became political entities with their own courts, alliances, and feudal systems, blending European feudal traditions with the realities of ruling in the Eastern Mediterranean. Godfrey of Bouillon refused the title of King of Jerusalem, instead taking the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, claiming he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. His short rule set the tone for a kingdom that balanced religious symbolism with the practical demands of defense and governance. The capture of Jerusalem in 1099 was both a stunning military achievement and the start of nearly 2 centuries of intermittent warfare between Crusader states and surrounding Muslim powers. It reshaped the political and religious landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean, turning the city into a focal point for both Christian pilgrimage and Islamic resistance, a legacy that would echo through the centuries. 1122, Concordat of Worms, ends the investiture controversy. It's the year 1122, and the long, exhausting tug of war between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor finally reaches a formal resolution, at least on paper. This is the Concordat of Worms, a name that sounds like an odd culinary experiment, but actually marks the end of the investiture controversy, a dispute that had been tearing at the very fabric of church-state relations in medieval Europe for nearly half a century. At its heart was one question: who gets to appoint bishops and abbots? The Pope, as the spiritual leader of Christendom, or the Emperor, as the secular ruler who believed these offices carried vital political weight? For decades, this power struggle had resulted in political maneuvering, excommunications, civil wars, and more than a little name-calling in the official correspondence. The controversy had begun in earnest in the late 11th century, when Pope Gregory VII insisted that only the Church could appoint bishops. Emperor Henry IV disagreed, loudly, and went ahead with his own appointments, treating bishoprics like prime political prizes. The Pope responded by excommunicating Henry, and in a famous episode in 1077, the Emperor trekked through winter snows to the castle of Canossa, barefoot and humiliated, to seek absolution. But the tension never really went away. Over the next decades, both sides continued to wrestle over who held the right to invest a church official with the symbols of office. Spiritual authority represented by the ring and staff, and temporal authority often tied to lands and political control. By 1122, Pope Calixtus II and Emperor Henry V decided it was time to put the feud to rest, if only to restore stability in the empire and the church. Meeting in the German city of Worms, they hammered out a compromise. Under the Concordat, the emperor formally renounced the right to invest bishops with spiritual symbols, the ring and staff, acknowledging that only the Pope could confer spiritual authority. In return, the Church agreed that imperial representatives could be present at elections of bishops within the empire, and that the emperor retained the right to invest them with the symbols of their temporal authority, usually a scepter, after their election. This arrangement drew a clear, if somewhat blurry in practice, line between spiritual and secular power. While it didn't eliminate political influence in church appointments, emperors and kings still found ways to get their candidates chosen. It was a milestone in defining the respective spheres of church and state. The Concordat of Worms also set a precedent for resolving such disputes through negotiation rather than outright warfare, and it helped stabilize the political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Though future conflicts between popes and emperors were inevitable, the 1122 agreement remains a landmark in the delicate balancing act between medieval crown and crosier. 1187. Saladin recaptures Jerusalem, leads to the Third Crusade. In the summer of 1187, the balance of power in the Holy Land shifted dramatically when Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin, recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders. For nearly 9 decades, since the First Crusade's bloody capture of the city in 1099, Jerusalem had been held by a patchwork of Christian rulers under the Kingdom of Jerusalem. By the mid-12th century, however, Saladin had united much of the Muslim world under his rule, bringing together Egypt, Syria, and other territories with the explicit aim of reclaiming the holy city for Islam. The decisive moment came after the catastrophic defeat of Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin in July 1887. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, was drawn into a trap, cut off from water, and crushed under the desert heat. Saladin's forces captured or killed most of the kingdom's knights, leaving the Christian strongholds vulnerable. One by one, cities across the Levant fell to Saladin's forces, culminating in the siege of Jerusalem in September. When Saladin's army arrived at the city, its defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, knew they could not hold out indefinitely. The city's fortifications were formidable, but the defenders were few, and Saladin's forces vastly outnumbered them. A direct assault threatened a massacre like that of 1099, when Crusaders slaughtered thousands of Muslims and Jews after taking the city. However, Saladin, known for his chivalry and strategic pragmatism, sought a negotiated surrender. After tense discussions, the two sides agreed. Jerusalem would surrender peacefully, and in exchange, its Christian inhabitants could ransom their freedom. Those unable to pay were, in many cases, released out of mercy or through charitable efforts organized by both Muslims and Christians. On October 2nd, 1187, coinciding with the Islamic holiday of Isra and Miraj, Saladin entered Jerusalem. Islamic banners were raised over the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, both of which were cleansed and reconsecrated for Muslim worship. Churches were largely left intact, and Christian pilgrims were still allowed to visit under certain conditions, marking a stark contrast to the brutality of earlier conquests. The loss of Jerusalem shocked Europe. News of the city's fall galvanized the papacy, and Pope Gregory VIII issued the bull Audita Tremendi, calling for a new crusade. This appeal sparked the Third Crusade, drawing leaders such as Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire to the Levant. Though the Third Crusade would achieve notable victories, including the recapture of Acre, it would ultimately fail to retake Jerusalem. Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem became one of the most iconic episodes of the medieval world, remembered in both Christian and Muslim chronicles as a moment of high drama, shifting fortunes, and a rare instance of relative magnanimity in an age otherwise defined by religious warfare. 1215. Magna Carta signed limits the power of the English crown. It's the year 1215, and England is a kingdom on the edge of a very expensive tantrum. King John, the youngest son of Henry II, and the much less glamorous brother of Richard the Lionheart, has managed to irritate pretty much everyone with a sword, a coin purse, or a Bible. His reign has been a string of military blunders, losing Normandy to France, heavy taxation to fund those blunders, and spectacularly bad diplomacy with both his barons and the Pope. By the spring of 1215, the barons have had enough. These aren't the bow and arrow in the mud kind of nobles. They're some of the most powerful landowners in the realm, the medieval equivalent of billionaire oligarchs, and they're armed to the teeth. They band together in open rebellion, seizing London in May and forcing the king to negotiate. John, perhaps sensing that the alternative might involve his head being displayed somewhere decorative, agrees to meet them at Runnymede, a meadow along the River Thames. What follows is less of a friendly sit-down and more of a tense political hostage situation disguised as a picnic. The result is the Magna Carta, Latin for Great Charter. This document contains 63 clauses, many of them hyper-specific medieval complaints, no more excessive tolls on bridges, and you can't force a widow to remarry. But a few with teeth. The king must obey the law, taxes require common consent, and free men have the right to a fair trial. It's not democracy as we know it. Most people in England still have about as much political power as a turnip, but it's a crack in the armor of absolute monarchy. John signs it on June 15th, 1215, but let's not pretend he has a sudden change of heart. Within weeks, he's writing letters to the Pope, asking to have it annulled. The Pope, ever happy to back a king against rebellious nobles, obliges, declaring the charter null and void. This, predictably, plunges the country into the First Barons' War. Civil war rages until John's death in 1216, when his 9-year-old son, Henry III, takes the throne, and the Magna Carta is reissued in a less confrontational tone. While the Magna Carta of 1215 was a messy, short-lived compromise, its legacy would grow far beyond what any of those angry nobles imagined. Over the centuries, it became a symbol of the principle that nobody, not even a king, is above the law. It inspired legal reforms in England, the American colonies, and democracies around the world. So while John probably saw it as a temporary annoyance, history remembers it as the moment England planted the seed for constitutional government, and possibly the first time a group of rich guys got together and told a monarch, "No, you can't do that." 1227, Death of Genghis Khan. Mongol Empire continues under successors. It was the year 1227, and the steppe winds carried whispers of something unthinkable. Genghis Khan, the man whose very name could stop a heartbeat, was gone. News traveled slowly across the vast Mongol Empire, but when it reached the ears of his generals, the reaction was not of public mourning. In fact, the truth of his death was kept as secret as the location of his burial. The Khan's enemies could never be allowed to sense weakness, not when the empire stretched from the Yellow River to the edges of Europe and still hungered for more. By that year, Genghis Khan had already carved the largest contiguous land empire in human history. His campaigns had toppled kingdoms, broken empires, and united the warring tribes of the Mongolian plateau into a single, unstoppable force. But he was no ordinary conqueror. He was also a political visionary, crafting a system of merit-based promotion, religious tolerance, and trade networks, that would shape the Silk Road for centuries. Still, the Khan was mortal, and whether he fell in battle against the Western Xia, died from illness, or, according to one legend, was fatally injured in a horse-riding accident, his death was certain. The Mongol leadership faced a challenge: how to ensure the empire didn't fracture the moment its founder was gone. The Great Khan's death was concealed until after the decisive defeat of the Western Xia, so that morale and fear of Mongol retribution remained high. His body was carried back to Mongolia to be buried in a secret location in the Khenti Mountains, accompanied by a funeral procession so discreet that, according to law, anyone who saw it was killed to preserve secrecy. His final resting place remains undiscovered to this day, shrouded in myth. Succession passed to his third son, Ogedei, chosen years earlier by Genghis himself. The transition was remarkably smooth, testament to the Khan's foresight and planning for the future. Under Ogedei and subsequent Khans, the Mongol Empire continued to expand, pushing deeper into Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and southern China. Yet, while the military machine roared on, it did so under the shadow of a man whose ambition had set it all in motion. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 was more than the passing of a ruler. It was the moment a man became legend. His name would echo not just in the chronicles of history, but in the terrified prayers of those who remembered the thunder of hoofbeats on the horizon. Even centuries later, in lands he never set foot in, the word Mongol carried his spirit, a reminder that one man's vision and will could change the world forever. 1258, sack of Baghdad. Mongols end the Abbasid Caliphate. It is the year 1258, and the jewel of the Islamic world, Baghdad, stands at the height of its cultural and intellectual glory. For centuries, it has been the beating heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. A city of palaces, gardens, libraries, and scholars whose works shaped medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics for much of the known world. The House of Wisdom, a great repository of knowledge, holds countless manuscripts collected from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. Merchants fill its bustling markets, poets recite verses in its gardens, and the Caliph, Al-Mustasim, still presides, though the Caliphate's political power has long been waning. Far to the east, however, a storm is gathering. Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, has been tasked by the great Khan Monka to subdue the Muslim world and extend Mongol control into the Middle East. In 1257, his armies march west, an unstoppable tide of mounted warriors, siege engineers from China and Persia, and fearsome reputation. The Mongols have already crushed the formidable fortress of Alamut and the Nizari Ismaili assassins, breaking one of the region's strongest defensive networks. Baghdad is next. Hulagu sends word to Al-Mustasim demanding submission. The Caliph refuses, some say, out of arrogance, others from misplaced faith that the city's walls and divine favor will protect it. In January 1258, the Mongol host arrives. For weeks, they encircle the city, erect siege engines, and tighten their grip. The Mongols construct wooden palisades and dig trenches to prevent escape. Then the bombardment begins. Massive stone projectiles and flaming missiles raining down, smashing through Baghdad's defenses. By mid-February, the walls are breached. Mongol troops pour in. For 7 days, Baghdad experiences a cataclysm unmatched in its history. The city is sacked, its population slaughtered. Chroniclers speak of hundreds of thousands killed, though exact figures are debated. The Tigris River is said to have run black with the ink of manuscripts thrown from the House of Wisdom, and red with the blood of its inhabitants. Hulagu spares neither mosque nor market. The caliph himself is executed, reportedly rolled into a carpet and trampled to death by horses, in accordance with Mongol custom of avoiding spilling royal blood. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 marks the definitive end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a political entity. Though an Abbasid line continues in Cairo under Mamluk protection, it is a shadow of its former self. The Islamic Golden Age, which had radiated from Baghdad for centuries, is dealt a fatal blow. The Mongols, having annihilated one of the world's greatest centers of learning and culture, turned their eyes to Syria, leaving behind a city in ruins, a river choked with memory, and a warning to all who would oppose them. 1271. Marco Polo departs for Asia, expands Europe's knowledge of the East. It's the year 1271, and you're standing in the bustling port city of Venice, where the air smells of salt, spices, and possibility. Among the merchants loading ships and the fishermen mending nets, there's a tall, sharp-eyed 17-year-old named Marco Polo. His father, Niccolo, and uncle Maffeo have just returned from a years-long trade journey that took them farther east than most Venetians could even imagine. They bring with them tales of a vast and glittering empire ruled by the Mongols, an empire so wealthy and strange it seems almost like a dream. They speak of the great Khan, whose court is richer than any king's in Europe, and of cities with markets overflowing with silk, jade, and spices that make pepper seem bland. Marco listens like someone who's been handed the key to another world. His father and uncle aren't here to rest. They're here to go back, and this time they want Marco to join them. Their route will not be simple. The Polo family must travel overland, through a patchwork of kingdoms and treacherous wilderness. They leave Venice by ship, crossing the Mediterranean and skirting the dangers of pirate waters. From the Levant, they push into the harsh landscapes of the Middle East, deserts where water is as precious as gold, and cities where minarets pierce the sky. They travel through Armenia and Persia, across plains swept by cold winds, and into territories patrolled by Mongol horsemen. Marco soaks in everything. He learns bits of Persian and Turkish, studies maps that look like spiderwebs of rivers and trade routes, and watches how goods and stories flow along the Silk Road. The journey is exhausting. Sandstorms, bandits, political unrest, and the constant challenge of staying healthy far from home. But the farther they go, the stranger and richer the world becomes. By the time they reach the Mongol domains, Marco has begun keeping detailed mental notes. He's struck by the efficiency of Mongol relay stations, rest stops with fresh horses that make travel astonishingly fast. He sees cities with canals as wide as rivers, Buddhist temples alive with incense and chanting, and markets selling rhubarb, pearls, and paper money, a concept almost unheard of in Europe. When they finally reach the court of Kublai Khan in China, Marco is ready for more than just a polite audience. He will spend years here, serving as an envoy and traveling even deeper into Asia, from the jungles of Burma to the palaces of Cathay. His observations, later written down in the Travels of Marco Polo, will ignite European curiosity about the East, fueling centuries of exploration, trade, and eventually, empire. But in this moment, in 1271, he is simply a young man at the edge of the known world, about to step off the map and into history. 1291, fall of Acre, end of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. It's the year 1291, and the salty air of the Levant is thick with tension. Acre, the last significant Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, stands like a stubborn stone tooth on the Mediterranean coast, weathered, battered, and surrounded by enemies. For nearly 2 centuries, Crusaders have carved out a tenuous presence in this land, building castles, trading hubs, and fragile alliances. But the tide has shifted. The Mamluk Sultanate, led by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, has decided to rip this foreign root from the soil once and for all. The siege begins in April. The Mamluks arrive in force, tens of thousands of soldiers, siege engines creaking like angry beasts, and catapults that hurl great stones against Acre's walls. Inside, the defenders are a patchwork of knights from various orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, alongside merchants, townsfolk, and refugees from other lost Crusader cities. The air inside the city is a stew of fear and determination. Some speak bravely of holding out as Jerusalem had once been held. Others whisper of finding ships to escape. Diplomacy flickers briefly. Envoys attempt to negotiate, but mistrust runs deep. The Mamluks remember broken treaties. The Crusaders remember massacres. The truce fails. The siege tightens. Over the next weeks, Acre's outer walls crumble under relentless bombardment. Arrows whistle day and night. Fires sweep through districts as defenders rush to patch breaches in the walls. From the towers, Crusader archers rain bolts upon the attackers, but the enemy numbers are overwhelming. On May 18th, the final assault begins. The Mamluks surge through a breach, and brutal street fighting erupts. Knights fight with desperate ferocity, their white mantles stained with blood and dust. Civilians flee toward the harbor, where Venetian and Genoese ships wait to take on as many as they can. The harbor becomes a chaos of screaming, splashing, and splintering wood, as too many people try to cram onto too few vessels. By the end of the day, the city is in flames. The last defenders retreat into the Templar stronghold, a fortress within the city, holding out for several days more before it too falls. The Mamluks dismantle the city's walls, determined to ensure Acre can never again serve as a Crusader base. The fall of Acre marks the end of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. From this moment, Christian control in the region is gone, and the dream of retaking Jerusalem fades into a distant, almost mythical ambition. For the people of medieval Europe, the news is a shock, an ending to 2 centuries of religious warfare that had shaped politics, trade, and identity. For the Mamluks, it is a triumph cementing their dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. And for Acre itself, it is the closing of one chapter and the beginning of centuries as a prize fought over by new powers. 1295. Model Parliament in England sets precedent for parliamentary governance. It's the year 1295, and England is a realm in transition, caught between the remnants of feudal order and the stirrings of something new, something that smells faintly of parchment, ink, and the long speeches of men who enjoy hearing themselves talk. King Edward I, known for his military campaigns and firm hand in governance, had already proven he could marshal armies, fortify castles, and subdue the Welsh. But now he was about to fortify something far less tangible, the very way political power was organized in England. This was the year of what would later be called the Model Parliament, a gathering whose structure set a precedent that would echo through centuries of governance. Edward had his reasons for summoning such a body, and they weren't entirely altruistic. War with France and unrest in Scotland had drained his coffers, and to keep the military machine running, he needed money. Traditionally, the king could levy certain taxes, but the big revenue raisers required consent from his realm's power brokers, the nobles, the clergy, and increasingly, representatives from towns and shires. The 1295th Parliament was Edward's masterstroke in packaging all these voices together in one formal assembly. The invitation list was telling. Alongside barons and bishops, Edward summoned 2 knights from each county and 2 burgesses, town representatives, from each borough, plus 2 citizens from certain cities. This was significant because it brought together not just the great landholders and church leaders, but also men who represented the emerging commercial and urban classes. By uniting these different estates in a single body, Edward created a forum where the king could present his needs and where subjects could, at least in theory, present grievances in return. When they convened, it wasn't exactly a democratic free-for-all. The king still controlled the agenda, and real power remained concentrated in the monarchy and nobility. But the model parliament structure, which came to include lords spiritual, lords temporal, and commons, became the template for the English parliament's later development. The gathering demonstrated that the consent of a broader cross-section of society, or at least its most influential representatives, could be harnessed to legitimize royal authority and taxation. Edward's 1295 innovation didn't overthrow the medieval order, far from it, but it planted a seed. Over time, that seed would grow into a principle, that governance required consultation, that taxation without representation would not stand unchallenged, and that even kings needed to negotiate. In its own way, the model parliament was both a tool of royal pragmatism and a step toward a more participatory political tradition. It was medieval politics with the touch of modern architecture, a chamber whose echoes still rumble through Westminster today. 1309. Avignon papacy begins. Papal court moves from Rome to Avignon. It's the year 1309, and the center of the Catholic world is about to pack its bags. For centuries, Rome had been the undisputed home of the papacy, a place where popes ruled with spiritual authority, surrounded by the relics and grandeur of the ancient city. But politics, war, and a dash of French influence were about to change that. The Avignon papacy began when Pope Clement V, a Frenchman elected in 1305, decided not to return to Rome after his coronation. Instead, citing political instability and violent factionalism in the Eternal City, he chose to set up shop in the small but strategically located city of Avignon on the Rhone River in southern France. Of course, this wasn't just a matter of Rome's a bit rough right now. The real story had more to do with the growing power of the French monarchy, especially King Philip IV, Philip the Fair, who had clashed with the papacy before. Clement V was seen as sympathetic to French interests, and his move to Avignon placed the papacy under a much stronger French shadow. While technically outside the Kingdom of France, Avignon was under the control of the papal vassals, the Counts of Provence, and was surrounded by French territory. This allowed the papacy to maintain a fig leaf of independence while enjoying the security and influence of its most powerful Catholic kingdom. The move marked the beginning of a 67-year period in which 7 successive popes resided in Avignon instead of Rome. These years transformed the papacy into something more bureaucratic, centralized, and, according to critics, more lavish and worldly. The court in Avignon was efficient and well organized, but it also developed a reputation for opulence. Chroniclers complained about the extravagant banquets, the fine wines, and the richly adorned papal palace, which stood in stark contrast to the vows of humility preached by the Church. This period also deepened political tensions in Europe. Many Italians resented what they saw as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, a term famously used by Petrarch, the poet and humanist, who longed for a return to Rome's spiritual and cultural primacy. The absence of the Pope from Rome weakened papal authority in the city, leading to unrest and the rise of local power struggles. Meanwhile, other European powers worried that the papacy was becoming little more than a French puppet. The Avignon papacy would eventually contribute to the crises of the 14th century, including the Western Schism, when rival popes claimed the throne of St. Peter. But in 1309, it simply began as a relocation, one that would reshape the political and spiritual map of medieval Europe for decades. This move of the papal court wasn't just a change of address, it was a shift in the balance of religious and political power that echoed through the entire continent. 1337. 100 Years' War begins. England versus France in a long dynastic conflict. It's the year 1337, and the air between England and France is thick with tension, the sort that can smolder for decades before bursting into flame. On paper, it begins as a squabble over thrones and inheritance rights, but in practice, it will become a 116-year tangle of battles, treaties, betrayals, and brief interludes of peace, all stitched together into what history now calls the 100 Years' War. At the center is a question of succession. France's king, Charles IV, dies without a direct male heir, and according to the French interpretation of Salic law, the crown cannot pass through the female line. That means Edward III of England, though the son of Charles's sister, is out of the running, at least as far as French nobles are concerned. Instead, they choose Philip VI, a cousin of Charles, to wear the crown. Edward, however, sees things differently, and when territorial disputes over English holdings in France flare up, the royal snub becomes the spark that lights a long and brutal fire. The opening act plays out in the English Channel and along the coasts. England, with its formidable navy, begins raiding French ports and disrupting trade, striking where it can inflict the most pain without committing to an all-out land war. But soon, battles spill onto the fields of northern France. The English longbow, a weapon simple in design but devastating in the hands of trained archers, begins to tilt the odds in Edward's favor. At the Battle of Crecy in 1346, English forces, heavily outnumbered, hold their ground and shatter the French army, setting a grim precedent for the many clashes to come. And yet, this is no continuous brawl from start to finish. The 100 Years' War is more like a series of storms, separated by uneasy calms. The Black Death sweeps across Europe in the late 1340s, pausing large-scale campaigns, but also leaving fields empty, treasuries drained, and armies weakened. Treaties like the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 offer temporary peace, granting England vast swaths of French land, only for hostilities to reignite a decade later when promises break and ambitions resurface. Over its long course, the war reshapes both kingdoms. In England, the conflict fosters a sense of emerging national identity, while in France, it eventually fuels a push for unity under the crown. Figures like the teenage Joan of Arc will rise in the later phases, shifting the tide with a mix of military success and symbolic power. By the time the war finally ends in 1453, with the French reclaiming nearly all territories once held by the English, an entire century's worth of generations had been marked by the conflict. What began in 1337 as a dynastic quarrel leaves behind new ideas of sovereignty, changes in medieval warfare, and a deep scar across the history of both nations. 1347 to 1351. Black Death. Pandemic kills a third of Europe's population. It's the year 1347, and an invisible enemy has just arrived in Europe, not with a roar of armies or the creak of siege engines, but with the quiet scratch of fleas in the fur of black rats. They slip off merchant ships docking in Sicily, having sailed from ports in the Crimea, where rumors already spoke of the great mortality sweeping across the lands. What comes next will be one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, the Black Death. The disease spreads with terrifying speed along trade routes, following merchant caravans, river barges, and the bustling marketplaces that knit Europe together. By the time many towns hear whispers of it, the sickness is already within their walls. Victims often begin with a fever and a crushing fatigue, followed by the appearance of large, painful swellings in the armpits and groin, buboes. Some cough blood, Others develop blackened sores, leading people to call it the Black Death. Death can come within days, sometimes even hours. Between 1347 and 1351, the pandemic claims the lives of an estimated 1/3, perhaps even half, of Europe's population. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London see entire neighborhoods emptied. In rural villages, fields lie untilled as whole families perish. The labor shortage is so severe that in some areas, surviving peasants can demand higher wages and better conditions, permanently altering the balance between landowners and workers. Panic breeds superstition and violence. Some blame the alignment of planets. Others accuse minority communities, such as Jews, of poisoning wells, leading to horrific massacres. In the streets, processions of flagellants march from town to town, whipping themselves in hopes of earning God's mercy. Priests struggle to administer last rites fast enough, and mass graves fill at an alarming pace. Yet, in the midst of unimaginable loss, the pandemic reshapes Europe in lasting ways. The reduced population leads to shifts in land ownership, higher per capita wealth for survivors, and in some places, the weakening of feudal structures. It also fuels advances in medicine and public health, as scholars seek to understand contagion, even if they still lack the germ theory of disease. By 1351, the first great wave of the Black Death recedes, but it leaves deep scars, both in the land and in the minds of those who remain. For decades afterward, sporadic outbreaks will return, a grim reminder that the world has changed forever. The memory of those years will haunt Europe, shaping art, religion, and society for generations. 1378. Western Schism. Rival popes divide Christendom. It's the year 1378, and Christendom, once united under a single pontiff, suddenly finds itself with not one pope, but two. The drama begins in Rome after the death of Pope Gregory XI, the last pope to reside in Avignon. His passing leaves the cardinals in a precarious position. The Roman populace, fearing that the papacy might once again pack up and return to Avignon, floods the streets, shouting for an Italian pope. The pressure is so intense that the conclave, terrified of riots, elects Bartolomeo Prignano, an Italian archbishop who takes the name Urban VI. Urban VI begins with promises of reform, but it doesn't take long for his sharp tongue and abrasive style to alienate many of the cardinals who elected him. He berates them openly, accuses them of corruption, and shows no interest in playing the courtly political game that had long defined papal diplomacy. Offended and alarmed, a group of French cardinals flees Rome, claiming that the election was made under duress from the mob, thus invalid in their eyes. In September 1378, those same cardinals convene in Fondi and elect a rival pope, Robert of Geneva, who takes the name Clement VII. With two popes now both claiming to be the true vicar of Christ, Christendom is split. Urban VI continues to reign from Rome, while Clement VII sets up his papal court in Avignon, reviving the so-called Avignon papacy in direct opposition to the Roman line. The result is not just a theological headache, but a geopolitical nightmare. Kingdoms and principalities choose sides, often based on political alliances rather than purely religious conviction. France, Scotland, and several Spanish kingdoms recognize Clement VII in Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy throw their support behind Urban VI in Rome. The rivalry turns the papacy into a mirror of Europe's political rivalries, with each pope excommunicating the other and their respective supporters. This period, known as the Western Schism, lasts nearly 40 years. The schism doesn't mean there are two separate churches. Everyone still considers themselves Catholic. But it does mean that the unity of the church is badly fractured. Both papal courts spend lavishly to maintain legitimacy, sell indulgences to raise funds, and engage in the kind of politicking more associated with royal courts than spiritual leadership. The conflict eventually spirals into an even greater mess when, in an attempt to solve the schism, the Council of Pisa in 1409 elects a third pope, Alexander V, meaning for a brief time there are three rival pontiffs. The crisis is not resolved until the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, which deposes or accepts the resignation of all claimants and elects Martin V, restoring a single recognized pope. The Western Schism left deep scars on the papacy's reputation, undermined its moral authority, and planted seeds of doubt about the institution's unity, seeds that would bear bitter fruit during the Reformation a century later. 1381. Peasants' revolt in England. Challenge to feudal oppression. It's the summer of 1381, and England is simmering like a pot left too long on the fire. For decades, the lower classes have borne the brunt of war taxes, inflation, and restrictive feudal laws that keep them tied to the land. Then comes the Black Death, which kills nearly half the population. Labor becomes scarce, wages rise by natural supply and demand, and the ruling elite responds not with gratitude, but with laws like the Statute of Laborers, 1351, which freezes wages at pre-plague levels and fines any worker who dares to ask for more. Layer in the poll taxes, flat rate levies on every adult, rich or poor, and you've got the perfect recipe for rebellion. It sparks first in Essex and Kent, where government tax collectors arrive and push too far. Local villagers refuse payment, chase the collectors away, and begin organizing armed groups. Leadership emerges in figures like Wat Tyler, a charismatic veteran who speaks plainly and fights fiercely. Alongside him are radical preachers like John Ball, who delivers sermons questioning the very foundations of medieval hierarchy. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In other words, God didn't make nobles and peasants. People did, and people can undo it. Within weeks, thousands of peasants, artisans, and discontented townsfolk march toward London. They are disciplined for a movement born of desperation, organized in columns, avoiding random looting, and openly declaring their demands: the end of serfdom, fair wages, the removal of corrupt royal advisors, and a general pardon for all rebels. As they reach London in June, the city's gates open, some from sympathy, others from fear. The rebels pour in, executing notorious officials, destroying records of feudal obligations, and forcing a face-to-face with 14-year-old King Richard II. At Mile End, Richard meets them and, astonishingly, agrees to many of their demands, perhaps thinking he can promise now and retract later. But before the deal is cemented, tensions flare. At Smithfield, an altercation leads to the sudden death of Wat Tyler, cut down by the king's men. The young king rides forward, boldly calling for calm, assuring the leaderless rebels that he himself will be their chief and captain. It works for a moment. The army disperses, trusting the king's word. But within days, promises are broken, leaders are hunted, and concessions are revoked. John Ball is captured and executed, others are hanged, and the feudal order, though shaken, remains in place. Yet the revolt plants a seed, the idea that commoners can organize, articulate grievances, and challenge the entire medieval hierarchy. It will be another 3 centuries before England begins to dismantle serfdom, but the shockwaves of 1381 echo for generations. 1415, Battle of Agincourt, English victory in the 100 Years' War. It's the year 1415, and the fields of northern France are about to turn into a muddy, arrow-littered legend. The 100 Years' War had already been dragging on for decades, but this particular clash, near a little village called Agincourt, would become one of the most famous, and frankly, most improbable, English victories in medieval history. King Henry V of England had marched his army deep into France after a long siege at Harfleur. The campaign had been brutal. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion had thinned his forces, and by the time he decided to head for the safety of Calais, he had perhaps 6,000 men left. Unfortunately for Henry, the French army, numbering somewhere between 12,000 and 30,000, depending on which chronicler you believe, was waiting for him on the road near Agincourt. They were heavily armored knights, the pride of France's chivalry, and they believed the English would be crushed in a glorious charge. The French confidence was understandable. The English were starving, caked in mud, and desperately outnumbered. But the battlefield itself turned out to be Henry's greatest ally. The ground between the two armies was narrow farmland, hemmed in by thick woods on either side, and thanks to recent rain, it had turned into a sticky, boot-sucking quagmire. Henry's troops, most of them longbowmen, took up defensive positions with sharpened stakes in front of them, while the French had no choice but to advance straight into the bottleneck. When the battle began on October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, English arrows darkened the sky. The longbow had already proved its worth in earlier battles like Crécy and Poitiers, and here it was, devastating. Arrows pierced through armor gaps, struck horses, and sowed chaos. The French knights, weighed down by plate armor and bogged in the mud, became easy targets. Those in the rear pushed forward, trapping the men in the front in a mass of flailing, suffocating humanity. Henry himself fought in the thick of it, famously taking a blow to his helmet that could have killed him. By the time the fighting ended, French losses were staggering. Some estimates put them at 6,000 dead, including many high-ranking nobles, while English casualties were relatively light. Agincourt became more than just a battle. It was a story of cunning, endurance, and the underdog's triumph. It boosted English morale and prestige, securing Henry's reputation as a warrior king. In the centuries that followed, it was immortalized in chronicles, paintings, and most famously, Shakespeare's Henry V, where the Band of Brothers speech still echoes the improbable victory. For medieval Europe, Agincourt was proof that sometimes mud, arrows, and strategy could humble even the most glittering knightly army. 1431 Execution of Joan of Arc. Martyrdom strengthens French unity. It is the spring of 1431, and the city of Rouen holds its breath. The 100 Years' War has dragged on for nearly a century, and this morning will become one of its most infamous moments. Joan of Arc, the 19-year-old peasant girl who claimed divine visions told her to lead France to victory, is to be burned at the stake. Captured the previous year by Burgundian forces and sold to the English, Joan has been put through a long and politically charged trial. Her accusers call her a heretic, a witch, and a blasphemer. They accuse her of dressing like a man, of claiming God's voice speaks to her, and of defying the authority of the church. But those who admire her see her as something else entirely, a saint in the making. In the damp morning light, she is led from her cell in the castle to the old marketplace. Her hands are bound, but she walks steadily. Witnesses say she keeps her eyes fixed ahead, murmuring prayers. The crowd is a mixture of English soldiers, French townsfolk, and church officials. Some have come to jeer, others have come to weep. The tall wooden stake stands ready, piled high with dry kindling. The smell of pitch and smoke already hangs in the air. A priest offers her the cross, and she clutches it tightly. She asks for another to be held high before her eyes, so she may see it through the rising flames. Her voice is steady as she declares her innocence and forgiveness for her enemies. I did not do the things for which I am condemned, she says, and I forgive you. When the torch is brought forward, the square falls silent except for the crackle of fire. The smoke rises quickly, engulfing her. Some say they hear her calling upon Jesus until her last breath. By the time the fire dies down, the English have reduced her to ashes to prevent relics from being taken. But they cannot burn away what she has come to mean. In death, she becomes a rallying symbol for the French cause. News of her execution spreads, stirring outrage and uniting French factions against their English occupiers. Over the years, her legend grows, transforming her from condemned heretic to beloved martyr. Nearly 5 centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church will canonize her as Saint Joan of Arc. But in 1431, in the smoky air of Rouen marketplace, she is simply a young woman who met death with courage and changed the course of a nation. 1453, fall of Constantinople, Ottoman Empire ends, Byzantine rule. It's the year 1453, and the air above the ancient city of Constantinople hangs heavy with the scent of gunpowder and sea salt. For more than 1,000 years, this city, perched between Europe and Asia, has been the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire. Its golden domes, high stone walls, and teeming harbors have weathered sieges before, but this spring feels different. To the east, Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire, just 21 years old, has brought an army of perhaps 80,000 men, an imposing fleet, and, most shockingly of all, massive cannons capable of hurling stone balls heavier than a man. The defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, number fewer than 10,000, including foreign mercenaries. Against overwhelming force, they cling to their posts on the great Theodosian walls, a structure that had stood for nearly a millennium. The siege begins in April. Day after day, the boom of the Ottomans' great bombards shakes the earth. The Byzantine defenders patch breaches at night, hauling stones and timber under the cover of darkness, but the damage accumulates. From the sea, the Ottomans block food and reinforcements, using chains to trap any Byzantine ships. A few Genoese allies arrive, but they can't turn the tide. Mehmed's forces tunnel under the walls, build siege towers, and maintain relentless pressure. Inside the city, churches are crowded with the faithful praying for divine intervention, while the streets grow quieter as supplies dwindle. In the early hours of May 29th, Mehmed launches his final assault. Waves of soldiers crash against the walls, first irregular troops, then disciplined janissaries. At a key point near the Kerkeporta gate, the defenses falter. Ottoman forces pour in. The emperor is said to have fought bravely in the chaos before vanishing into legend, his body never definitively identified. By sunrise, the city is in Ottoman hands. The consequences are immense. The Byzantine Empire, which traced its lineage back to the Roman Empire, is gone. Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Eastern Christianity, is converted into a mosque. The fall sends shockwaves across Europe, fueling fears of Ottoman expansion and spurring the search for new trade routes, one factor that will eventually push explorers westward toward the Americas. For the Ottomans, it's a crowning achievement. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, becomes the empire's thriving capital, a bridge between worlds. For the Byzantines, it's the end of an era. And for history, it's a moment that forever altered the balance of power between East and West. 1455, Gutenberg, Bible printed, birth of mass printing. It's the year 1455, and in a modest workshop in Mainz, Germany, an invention quietly changes the trajectory of human civilization. The air smells faintly of ink and metal, the sound of clinking typepieces, punctuated by the rhythmic creak of a hand-operated press. This is Johannes Gutenberg's world, half blacksmith's forge, half scribe's desk, where the first copies of what will become known as the Gutenberg Bible are taking shape. Before this moment, books were the rare treasures of monasteries and royal libraries. Each was painstakingly written by hand, letter by letter, on parchment or vellum. A skilled scribe might manage a few pages in a day, meaning that a single Bible could take years to complete. This bottleneck kept knowledge confined to the wealthy, the clergy, and the few scholars with access to these guarded collections. Most ordinary people might never in their lifetime see a book, let alone own one. Gutenberg's genius lay in combining several existing ideas: movable metal type, oil-based ink, and the screw press used in winemaking, into a single, efficient system for reproducing text. Instead of carving entire pages into wooden blocks, he cast individual letters from a durable alloy, arranging them into lines and pages that could be quickly reconfigured for the next sheet. His press applied steady, even pressure, transferring ink cleanly to the paper. The Gutenberg Bible itself was a triumph of both technology and artistry. Printed in Latin, it closely resembled the look of a manuscript, with crisp Gothic letters and hand-painted decorations added afterward to each copy. About 180 were produced, some on paper, others on more luxurious vellum, and many survive today, a testament to their craftsmanship. The impact of this development cannot be overstated. For the first time, books could be produced on a scale that dramatically lowered their cost and increased their availability. This democratization of knowledge weakened the monopoly of information held by religious and political elites. Literacy began to spread, slowly at first, then in a wave that fueled the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. Thinkers could share ideas more widely, and dissenting voices could find an audience far beyond their immediate surroundings. In 1455, few could have predicted that this invention would eventually lead to newspapers, novels, textbooks, and, centuries later, mass media and the internet. But standing in that workshop in Mainz, watching the press pull another page from the inked type, you'd sense that the world had shifted. Words, once locked away in cloisters and courts, were stepping out into the light, and they would never go back. 1492, Columbus reaches the Americas, start of European colonial expansion. It's the year 1492, a date every schoolchild learns, yet few imagine in its full, tangled reality. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese mariner with grand ambitions and a flair for persuasion, had convinced Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, that he could reach Asia not by the usual eastward route, but by sailing west across the Atlantic. The concept wasn't entirely unheard of, but Columbus's certainty, combined with Spain's fresh confidence after completing the Reconquista, made the timing ideal. The crown hungered for wealth, influence, and a way to outpace Portugal, whose ships were already tracing the African coast toward the riches of the East. In August, 3 ships left Palos de la Frontera: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The crews were a mixture of seasoned sailors, restless adventurers, and a few reluctant men coaxed aboard by pay or promise. The voyage tested everyone's endurance. Weeks passed without sight of land. Tension mounted. Mutiny seemed a whisper away. Columbus calmed the crew with a clever trick. He kept 2 ships' logs, one accurate for himself, another with shorter distances to reassure his men that they weren't hopelessly far from home. In the early hours of October 12th, a lookout on the Pinta cried land. They had reached an island in the Bahamas known to its inhabitants, the Taino, as Guanahani. Columbus, believing himself near Asia, claimed it for Spain. The Taino greeted the newcomers with generosity, unaware they were at the threshold of a world-changing, and for them, devastating encounter. When Columbus returned to Spain, his reception was nothing short of celebratory. He brought strange plants, colorful parrots, and several Taino captives, sparking visions of a new world filled with wealth and opportunity. The Crown quickly sponsored further voyages, shifting focus from finding a passage to Asia toward establishing colonies and extracting resources. This moment marked the dawn of the Columbian Exchange, a vast and ongoing transfer of crops, animals, technologies, and diseases across the Atlantic. Horses, cattle, wheat, and sugarcane traveled west. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao traveled east. The exchange transformed diets and economies worldwide, but also unleashed catastrophic epidemics, smallpox, measles, and influenza, on indigenous peoples, decimating populations. What happened in 1492 was not a simple discovery, but a collision of worlds. It set in motion centuries of exploration, conquest, and colonization, forever binding Europe, Africa, and the Americas in networks of trade, exploitation, and cultural transformation. In that single year, human history took a sharp turn toward a truly global age, an age whose consequences, both wondrous and tragic, still shape our world today. 1492, expulsion of Jews from Spain, end of centuries-old coexistence. It is the year 1492, and the air in Spain carries both the smell of triumph and the quiet ache of loss. The banners of Ferdinand and Isabella still hang proudly from fortress walls, celebrating the recent conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. Yet, as the ink dries on the treaty that ended centuries of Islamic rule, another document emerges from the royal court, one that will alter the fate of hundreds of thousands, the Edict of Expulsion. On March 31st, 1492, the monarchs signed the decree ordering all practicing Jews to leave their kingdoms within 4 months, unless they convert to Christianity. The official reason is framed as unity, a desire to end the supposed influence of Jews over new Christians, converts, many under suspicion of secretly maintaining Jewish customs. In reality, the edict is an intersection of political consolidation, religious zeal, and the pressures of the recently established Spanish Inquisition. For centuries, Jews had been an integral part of Iberian life. They worked as translators, physicians, financiers, artisans, and scholars. In cities like Toledo, Cordoba, and Seville, Jewish neighborhoods bustled with marketplaces, synagogues, and schools, contributing to what historians call la convivencia, a period of relative coexistence among Christians, Muslims, and Jews. But this coexistence had been eroding for generations, chipped away by waves of anti-Jewish riots, forced conversions, and increasingly restrictive laws. The decree strikes like a final hammer blow. Some families choose baptism to remain in their homes, often becoming conversos, who live under the shadow of the Inquisition scrutiny. Others pack what they can carry: clothes, family heirlooms, religious texts, and set out on uncertain journeys. Ports fill with desperate travelers bargaining for passage to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, or Italy. Ships leave, crowded with families who have sold everything for the voyage, only to face storms, piracy, or starvation. The cultural loss is immediate and immense. Libraries are dismantled, scholarly traditions uprooted, and centuries-old communities vanish from Spanish soil almost overnight. The economy feels the shift as skilled merchants, doctors, and financiers disappear. Yet beyond economics, the expulsion tears at the memory of shared life, a wound that will never fully heal. Ironically, the same year that sees this mass exile also witnesses Columbus's first voyage westward, launching Spain into an age of global expansion. For those forced from their homes, however, 1492 does not mark the start of a new world, but the end of one, a world where they had once believed faith and identity could survive alongside their neighbors. 1494. Treaty of Tordesillas divides the New World between Spain and Portugal. It's the year 1494, and the ink is still drying on one of the most audacious, "you take this half, we'll take that half," deals in history, the Treaty of Tordesillas. Spain and Portugal, the two dominant seafaring powers of the age, had been racing around the globe like rival treasure hunters, planting flags on any coastline that looked profitable or spiritually convertible. The discovery of the Americas by Columbus just 2 years earlier had set off a frenzy of claims, counterclaims, and "but we were here first" arguments between the two Iberian giants. Pope Alexander VI, eager to keep Christendom from descending into a maritime version of a family feud, had already issued a papal bull in 1493, drawing an imaginary line west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything west of the line went to Spain, and everything east went to Portugal. The problem? Portugal thought the line gave Spain far too much of the globe, and Portugal wasn't exactly a minor player. They had explorers like Vasco da Gama preparing to sail around Africa to reach India. So both sides sat down in the Spanish town of Tordesillas to redraw the world's borders as if they were dividing a pie. The result was a new line, shifted about 370 leagues farther west. Spain would have exclusive rights to lands west of this line, which, unbeknownst to them, would include most of the Americas, while Portugal got the east, including Africa, Asia, and, by a quirk of geography, a slice of South America that would become Brazil. Neither side consulted the people actually living in these lands, of course. To them, indigenous nations were not sovereign players, but souls to be saved or resources to be exploited. In the short term, the treaty gave each country confidence to pursue their respective exploration agendas without fear of interference from the other. Portugal would soon round the Cape of Good Hope and build a sprawling trading empire from East Africa to Japan. Spain, meanwhile, would plunge deep into the Americas, setting in motion centuries of conquest, colonization, and cultural upheaval. Looking back, the Treaty of Tordesillas was less a careful act of diplomacy than a bold cartographic gamble. Neither party had a complete map of the world, and their division line ran through oceans and lands they hadn't yet seen. But it set the tone for the age of exploration, a world where distant powers could carve up continents with the stroke of a quill, certain that the future belonged to whoever could sail there first. 1498. Vasco da Gama reaches India, maritime link between Europe and Asia. It's the year 1498, and the Indian Ocean is about to meet some new visitors. 4 years earlier, the Treaty of Tordesillas had drawn an invisible line on the map, granting Portugal rights to much of the world's eastern riches. But the trouble was, no one in Lisbon could actually reach them by sea. That is, until a determined nobleman named Vasco da Gama set sail from Portugal in 1497, following the daring path first hinted at by Bartolomeu Dias a decade earlier when he rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Da Gama's voyage was part exploration, part gamble, and part very expensive shopping trip, because what the Portuguese crown wanted most were the spices of India: pepper, cinnamon, cloves, the luxuries that in Europe cost more than gold by weight. The only problem was that Muslim and Venetian middlemen controlled the traditional overland and Red Sea routes, making Portugal's monarchs eager for a direct maritime link. Da Gama's fleet, 4 ships, including his flagship, the São Gabriel, hugged the African coast down past the Congo before making the perilous turn eastward around the Cape. Unlike previous voyages, they didn't simply trade with coastal towns and turn back. Instead, they ventured up the East African coast, stopping in places like Mozambique and Mombasa, where relations were, let's say, mixed. In some harbors, the Portuguese were welcomed with cautious curiosity. In others, they were greeted with hostile arrows. But in Malindi, in present-day Kenya, they found an ally. The local ruler provided an experienced navigator, often described as a pilot from Gujarat, who knew the monsoon winds like the back of his hand. This pilot guided them across the open Indian Ocean, riding the seasonal winds that had carried Arab and Indian traders for centuries. In May 1498, Da Gama's ships dropped anchor off the coast of Calicut, now Kozhikode, in southwestern India. This city was one of the great spice ports of the Malabar coast, a cosmopolitan marketplace where traders from Arabia, Persia, Africa, and Southeast Asia mingled. The Portuguese arrival was both a novelty and a disruption. These strange newcomers wore unfamiliar clothing, spoke an alien tongue, and, to the locals, seemed oddly fixated on black pepper. Initial negotiations with the Zamorin, the ruler of Calicut, were polite but tinged with suspicion. Da Gama brought gifts that in Lisbon would have been considered respectable: fine cloth, hats, corals. But here, they paled in comparison to the gems and gold expected in Indian diplomacy. Still, Da Gama succeeded in securing a letter of trade agreement and loading his ships with a modest cargo of spices before departing. The return voyage was brutal. Scurvy and storms took their toll, and of the original crew, many never saw Portugal again. But when the survivors limped back into Lisbon in 1499, their holds carried enough spice to pay for the voyage many times over. More importantly, they had proven that a direct maritime route between Europe and Asia was possible. This breakthrough reshaped global trade. Portuguese ships would soon dominate the Indian Ocean, establishing forts and trading posts from Africa to Malacca, often by force, and reshuffling centuries-old commercial networks. For India, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in which European powers would steadily expand their influence, drawn by the irresistible lure of peppercorns and profit. And for Da Gama himself, it secured a place in history as the man who quite literally put India on Portugal's map. 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral lands in Brazil, Portuguese claim in South America. It is the year 1500, and the age of discovery is in full, wind-filled swing. Pedro Álvares Cabral, a Portuguese nobleman and navigator, is commanding a fleet originally bound for India. Portugal, under King Manuel I, is determined to expand its maritime trade empire and outpace rivals like Spain in the race for spices, gold, and glory. Cabral's fleet of 13 ships sets sail from Lisbon in March, following the new sea route pioneered by Vasco da Gama around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. But instead of hugging the African coast as tightly as da Gama had, Cabral veers far to the west, likely due to navigational techniques, favorable winds, or possibly royal instructions to explore lands suggested by earlier voyages. This westward swing proves fateful. On April 22, 1500, Cabral's lookouts spot a lush, green coastline. He names it Terra da Vera Cruz, land of the true cross, and claims it for Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas, the 1494 agreement with Spain that divided the newly discovered world between the two powers. The fleet anchors in what is now Porto Seguro, in the modern state of Bahia, Brazil. The land is inhabited by the Tupiniquim people, who greet the Portuguese with curiosity. Early encounters are marked by cautious exchanges, gifts of beads, mirrors, and cloth for feathered headdresses and food. Cabral's scribes note the region's natural abundance, towering trees, exotic birds, and fertile soil, and importantly, the presence of Brazil wood, a valuable source of red dye coveted in Europe. Cabral orders a formal mass to be celebrated on the beach, the first recorded Christian service in South America, symbolizing Portugal's intent to both trade and evangelize. While no permanent settlement is established during this first landing, the Portuguese crown quickly grasps the territory's strategic and economic potential. Cabral leaves behind a small group to explore further before resuming his original mission to India. The claim marks the beginning of Brazil's colonial history. Over the next decades, Portugal will establish outposts, exploit Brazil wood, and eventually develop sugar plantations worked by enslaved labor from Africa, reshaping the land's social, cultural, and ecological fabric. The arrival in 1500 is remembered not as an accidental detour, but as a deliberate act of imperial expansion, an event that tied Brazil's destiny to Portugal for more than 3 centuries. 1517, Martin Luther's 95 Theses, Protestant Reformation begins. It's the year 1517, and a crisp autumn wind is blowing through the small German town of Wittenberg. On the 31st of October, a 33-year-old monk named Martin Luther, dressed in the plain brown habit of the Augustinian order, walks with a determined stride toward the castle church. In his hand, he carries a document that will ignite one of the most significant religious upheavals in European history, his disputation on the power and efficacy of indulgences, more famously known as the 95 Theses. At this time, the Catholic Church is at the height of its power, but it is also facing criticism for corruption and excess. One of the most controversial practices is the sale of indulgences, essentially pieces of parchment signed by church officials that promise the buyer a reduction in time spent in purgatory for sins. In theory, they are meant to be linked to sincere repentance, but in practice, they have become a massive fundraising tool, especially for financing grand projects such as the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In Luther's Germany, indulgence campaigns are so aggressive that priests and traveling preachers proclaim that buying one could absolve even the most grievous sins, or secure salvation for a loved one already deceased. Luther, a scholar and professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, has grown deeply troubled by this. In his view, salvation is granted by God's grace through faith, not by financial transactions or human merit. The Bible, he insists, should be the ultimate authority for Christian life, not papal decrees or church traditions that have drifted away from Scripture. His 95 Theses are intended as an academic invitation to debate, written in Latin, addressing theological concerns about indulgences and the misuse of church power. Legend says he nails the Theses to the door of the castle church, though some historians debate whether this dramatic moment actually happened or whether he simply sent them to his archbishop. Either way, the document quickly spreads beyond academic circles. Thanks to the relatively new technology of the printing press, copies are translated into German and distributed widely, reaching towns and cities across Europe in weeks. What Luther intended as a scholarly dispute becomes a public sensation. The reaction is explosive. Church authorities see his ideas as a direct threat to their spiritual and financial authority. Supporters rally to his cause, believing that the church needs deep reform. Within a few years, the movement sparked by Luther's protest grows into what we now call the Protestant Reformation, a seismic shift that will fracture Western Christianity, lead to decades of religious conflict, and ultimately reshape the political and cultural landscape of Europe. What began in 1517 as one monk's protest in a quiet university town will ripple outward for centuries, changing the way millions understand faith, authority, and their own relationship with God. 1521, Diet of Worms. Luther refuses to recant. It's the year 1521, and the air in the Holy Roman Empire is thick with tension, ink, and the smell of smoldering parchment. 4 years earlier, Martin Luther, a relatively obscure monk and theology professor from Wittenberg, had rattled the Catholic Church to its very core with his 95 Theses. Now, the firestorm he sparked had grown far too big to be ignored. The Pope had already excommunicated him, branding him a heretic. But this time, Luther was being summoned not by local clergy, but by the Emperor himself. The stage was set for the Diet of Worms, an imperial assembly in the German city of Worms, where Luther would be asked to answer for his writings. The stakes could not have been higher. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, was presiding, a young but powerful ruler who needed unity in his vast multi-ethnic empire. The Catholic Church was demanding Luther's head, but the political reality was more complicated. Many German princes, frustrated with Rome's taxes and influence, saw Luther's defiance as an opportunity to push back against papal authority. For them, Luther was more than a rebellious monk. He was a symbol of German independence. For Charles V, however, the thought of tolerating open defiance of the Pope threatened to unravel both church and empire. When Luther was brought into the Great Hall on April 17th, he found a table stacked high with his writings. The imperial spokesman asked a simple question with monumental consequences. Did he acknowledge these works as his own, and would he recant them? Luther's first instinct was caution. He asked for a day to think it over, a move that frustrated some of his allies, but also showed he understood the gravity of the moment. The next day, Luther returned. This time, his voice was steady, his words deliberate. He admitted freely that the books were his. As for recanting, that was another matter entirely. He explained that some of his works dealt with basic Christian faith, and to retract them would be to reject the gospel itself. Others criticized the corruption of church authorities, corruption so obvious that even his enemies, he argued, would not deny it. To retract these would be to encourage tyranny and abuse. Unless he could be persuaded by scripture or clear reason, he said, he could not and would not recant. Then came the famous words, in spirit, if not exact historical phrasing, here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen. The hall erupted, some in outrage, some in awe. Luther's refusal meant he was now officially an outlaw in the empire. Anyone could kill him without legal consequence. But his defiance also made him a hero to reformers and a dangerous figure to the established church. The Diet of Worms did not end the matter, far from it. But it was the moment Luther's movement stopped being an academic dispute and became a political and spiritual revolution. The Reformation, from that day, was unstoppable. 1526, Battle of Mohács, Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. It's the year 1526, and the fields near the Hungarian town of Mohács are about to witness one of the most lopsided and consequential battles in European history. On one side stands the young and inexperienced King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, just 20 years old, leading an army that is brave but poorly coordinated. On the other side is Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of the vast and disciplined Ottoman Empire, fresh from campaigns that have already stretched the empire's borders deep into Europe. The stakes are nothing less than the fate of Hungary itself and the direction of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. For years, the Hungarians had known the Ottomans were pressing closer. Belgrade had fallen in 1521, and the border fortresses were in poor repair. Louis II tried to rally support, but Hungary's nobility was divided, its treasury strained, and its military organization outdated. Still, when news arrived that Suleiman's massive army, some sources claim over 60,000 men, was advancing northward, the Hungarian leadership chose to meet them in the open field. Rather than risk a prolonged siege of Buda, they gathered roughly 25,000 troops, including heavy cavalry and infantry, but their forces lacked the unity and tactical flexibility of the Ottoman host. The battle itself was brutally short. On August 29th, the Hungarians launched an aggressive cavalry charge meant to break the Ottoman center before their full strength could deploy. At first, they made some headway, pushing back the vanguard, but Suleiman's forces, which included elite janissaries and formidable artillery, absorbed the attack and countered with devastating discipline. The Ottomans' firepower, combined with their superior maneuvering, quickly shattered the Hungarian lines. Within less than 2 hours, the battle was decided. King Louis II fled the field in the chaos, but his horse stumbled in a marshy riverbed, and the young king drowned under the weight of his armor. The loss was catastrophic. Thousands of Hungarian nobles and soldiers perished, decimating the kingdom's leadership. Mohács became synonymous with national tragedy for Hungarians, a symbol of political division and military unpreparedness. In the aftermath, Hungary was effectively broken as an independent power. The Ottomans swiftly occupied much of the kingdom, including Buda, while the Habsburgs claimed the western portion. This partition would last for more than a century and a half, making Mohács a turning point that reshaped Central Europe. For the Ottomans, the victory cemented Suleiman's reputation as a dominant force on the continent, marking a major step in their expansion that would bring them to the very gates of Vienna within decades. 1534, Act of Supremacy. Henry VIII declares himself head of the Church of England. It's the year 1534, and England is in the middle of a political and spiritual tug-of-war. For centuries, the Pope in Rome had been the ultimate authority over the English Church, a link in a chain of power that stretched across Christendom. But King Henry VIII, stubborn, ambitious, and unwilling to let his dynasty's future rest in papal hands, decided that this arrangement no longer suited him. The breaking point, his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to produce a surviving male heir. Pope Clement VII refused his request, partly because Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor. This was not just about theology, it was about politics, pride, and the control of England's destiny. Henry's solution was radical and unprecedented. If Rome would not give him what he wanted, he would sever Rome's authority over England entirely. The Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament in 1534, formally declared the king the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This was not some casual piece of legislation. It was the legal and spiritual earthquake that tore England from the Pope's jurisdiction. The act made it treason to refuse to acknowledge Henry's supremacy, with penalties that could lead to execution. Suddenly, loyalty to the Pope became a political crime, and the king's religious authority was as binding as his political rule. Henry moved swiftly to consolidate this new order. The act gave him control over the appointment of bishops, the definition of religious doctrine, and crucially, the vast wealth of the Church in England. Monasteries, some of them centuries old, were soon dissolved, their lands and treasures confiscated and redistributed to loyal nobles. For Henry, this was both a personal victory and a massive windfall. For devout Catholics in England, however, it was a disaster, cutting them off from the spiritual authority they had known all their lives. The Act of Supremacy didn't just change church governance, it rewrote the very nature of political loyalty. Figures like Sir Thomas More, who refused to acknowledge the king's supremacy, paid with their lives. England's religious identity fractured, setting the stage for decades of conflict between Catholics and Protestants. The shift also sent shockwaves across Europe, where other monarchs and reformers saw in Henry's move a precedent for challenging papal authority. In one stroke, Henry VIII had transformed himself from a monarch ruling under God's law, as interpreted by Rome, into a sovereign who claimed direct authority over both the body and the soul of his kingdom. The Act of Supremacy was not simply about a divorce, it was about the creation of a national church, an assertion of independence, and the opening salvo in England's turbulent Reformation. 1545 to 1563, Council of Trent, Counter-Reformation Reforms, Catholic Doctrine. It's the mid-16th century, and the Catholic Church is facing the most serious challenge in its long history. The Protestant Reformation, sparked in 1517 by Martin Luther's famous theses and spread rapidly through figures like John Calvin, has fractured Christendom. In lands from Germany to Scandinavia and parts of France, the authority of the Pope is openly rejected, and entire regions are reorganizing their religious life outside of Rome's control. In response, the Catholic Church doesn't simply defend itself, it launches a full-scale reform effort of its own, a movement historians call the Counter-Reformation. At the very center of this effort stands the Council of Trent, held intermittently between 1545 and 1563 in the northern Italian city of Trent. The council is convened by Pope Paul III, who recognizes that internal corruption and doctrinal confusion have left the Church vulnerable to criticism. Bishops, theologians, and other church officials from across Europe gather, though not all Catholic monarchs are equally cooperative, and political rivalries sometimes slow proceedings. The meetings are long, often tense, and spread out over 3 distinct periods, with interruptions caused by war, outbreaks of plague, and disputes over procedure. Still, the work that emerges from these sessions becomes the blueprint for Catholic life for the next 4 centuries. Doctrinally, the Council of Trent draws clear lines between Catholic teaching and Protestant theology. It reaffirms the authority of both Scripture and church tradition, rejecting the Protestant principle of sola scriptura. It declares that salvation comes through faith in good works, not faith alone, and it upholds the 7 sacraments as divinely instituted channels of grace. The Mass is defended as a true sacrifice, and the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Christ, is explicitly reaffirmed. On matters of reform, the Council takes aim at the abuses that had so damaged the Church's credibility. The selling of indulgences, which had been a major grievance for reformers, is curbed with clear rules to prevent financial exploitation. Bishops are ordered to reside in their own dioceses instead of living in Rome or other cities, and seminaries are to be established for the proper training of priests, ensuring higher levels of education and moral discipline among the clergy. The Council also standardizes Catholic worship, leading to the creation of the Roman Catechism and the Roman Missal, which unify liturgical practice across Catholic lands. Art and architecture are encouraged to inspire piety and communicate the majesty of the faith, fueling the Baroque style that will dominate Catholic Europe. When the Council of Trent finally concludes in 1563, it has not healed the rift in Christianity. The Protestant movement remains strong, but it has revitalized the Catholic Church from within. It gives Rome a clearer, more disciplined identity and launches a centuries-long era of missionary activity, education, and cultural patronage. In the battle for souls that defines the early modern period, Trent becomes the Catholic Church's declaration of resilience. 1588. Defeat of the Spanish Armada. England emerges as a naval power. In 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada marked one of the most dramatic turning points of the late 16th century, altering the balance of power in Europe and shaping the future of global exploration and empire. The backdrop was a long simmering rivalry between Catholic Spain, ruled by King Philip II, and Protestant England under Queen Elizabeth I. Religious tensions, fueled by the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, merged with political, economic, and personal animosities. Philip, once married to Elizabeth's half-sister Mary I, considered himself the rightful protector of English Catholics and saw Elizabeth as a heretic. England's support of Dutch rebels against Spanish rule and the persistent raids of English privateers, like Sir Francis Drake, against Spanish treasure fleets, only deepened the animosity. Philip's plan was audacious: assemble a massive fleet, the Invincible Armada, to sail from Spain to the Netherlands, pick up the Duke of Parma's seasoned army, and invade England. The Armada consisted of around 130 ships, carrying over 30,000 men, including soldiers, sailors, and priests. It was a formidable force, but also a logistical nightmare. Communication delays, coordination with Parma, and the unpredictable North Sea weather posed serious challenges from the outset. The English, aware of Spain's preparations, mobilized their navy. Though smaller in number, England's ships were more maneuverable, faster, and better suited for the choppy channel waters. They were also equipped with long-range cannons, enabling them to inflict damage without closing in for boarding, which had been the traditional naval tactic of the age. Sir Francis Drake, Lord Charles Howard, and other commanders employed hit-and-run tactics, harassing the Armada from Plymouth to Calais. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Gravelines in late July. The English unleashed fire ships, vessels packed with combustibles, set ablaze and sent drifting toward the anchored armada. The Spaniards, in panic, cut their anchor cables and scattered, breaking their tight defensive crescent formation. English gunners then seized the opportunity to bombard the disorganized ships, forcing the armada to retreat northward. Nature dealt the final blow. Storms battered the retreating Spanish fleet as it circled Scotland and Ireland to return home, sinking ships and killing thousands. Of the original 130 ships, barely half made it back to Spain, many damaged beyond repair. The psychological impact was immense. England's survival against Europe's greatest naval force bolstered Elizabeth's image as a divinely favored ruler and inspired a wave of national pride. Militarily, it did not end the Anglo-Spanish War, but it signaled the decline of Spanish maritime dominance and the rise of England as a major naval power. This shift would pave the way for England's own imperial ambitions in the centuries to come.